Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first meeting of the government. Can you hear me better now? I'm sorry. I want to welcome everybody here. This is the first election subcommittee of the Governmental Affairs Full Committee. We have before us today House Bill 316. As I can see, we do have a good bit of interest in this. The foundation of democracy is a accurate way of people voting. And I want to thank each and every person for being here today. Now, the process, I've just did a head count, and we do have a quorum of the subcommittee. We have a few other members of the full committee. For the purpose of navigating through this, since there seems to be a lot of interest and a lot of testimony today, questions in the subcommittee process can only be proposed by subcommittee members. Other members of governmental affairs are certainly welcome to be here, and if they wish to testify, they can certainly do so. And if they have questions, they'll have an opportunity, if and when this bill reaches full committee, to do so at that time. Because of the large number of people, and I've got a sign-up sheet here, and I think we've got 2 sign-up sheets, and I think there's probably another one floating around. We're going to give everybody every opportunity to speak, to be heard. I would ask, out of an abundance of caution, if what you've got to say seems to be redundant, then please speak quick. There's only so many times that you can hear the same story. But that being said, I'm a full believer that every person has a right to be heard. And that being said, I'm going to call on Chairman Fleming to present his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate y'all letting me be before you today. I appreciate your willingness to come here and take your time to hear this legislation, which I think will put Georgia voters first and move us into the 21st century with common sense reform and a straightforward voting system for our state. Georgia's current election system, as most of you know, is about 17 years old, and the question really is not if we're going to update it, but just how and when. House Bill 316 that you have in front of you would uniformly update Georgia's voting machines and incorporate an all-new paper ballot component. More specifically, House Bill 316 switches our state touchscreen marked paper to a touchscreen marked paper ballot system. Voters will make their selections on a touchscreen device similar to those that we now use. The touchscreen ballot marker will print a paper ballot with an exact copy of the voter's digital selections. After reviewing the paper ballot for accuracy, the voter would submit their paper ballot to be scanned and counted. That's a basic summary of what the system would look like. Currently, about 24 states use this modern touchscreen marked paper ballot system, primarily due to the fairly obvious advantages to voter accuracy and ballot accessibility. Touchscreen ballot markers leave absolutely no room of doubt of voter intent, since voters make clear choice by the touch of a button. Reverting back to any other form of a voting system, including a pencil-marked ballot, could easily force our state into a situation that we don't want to recall, like Florida in 2000, where they had so much trouble there. With a pencil-marked ballot, election officials, attorneys, and partisan vote reviewers have to interpret stray and accidental pencil marks on an improperly completed ballot, meaning that the voter may have their vote counted incorrectly or completely invalidated. Using a touchscreen, on the other hand, a ballot marking device is much like choosing to use a typewriter, in my opinion, to send something important instead of handwriting it, so that the recipient will understand exactly what your message was. Not only do touchscreen ballot markers provide the most accuracy and clarity in elections, but they also provide peace of mind through an audible paper ballot. The paper ballot enables voters to double-check their choices before casting their ballots and allows the counties to conduct an audit of the election results. Most importantly, the touchscreen ballot markers are carefully designed to prevent interference, which is why they are never connected to the internet and come equipped with external cabinetry that prevents physical tampering. It is far easier to fortify and monitor a touchscreen ballot system than it is to systematically secure pencil-marked ballots. Moving Georgia backwards, I believe, to a pencil-marked ballot system means that elections could be tampered with by anyone with a pencil. A stray mark can completely spoil a ballot, and since an eraser can easily change someone's vote. On the other hand, a touch screen marked paper ballot will also be the most accessible system for voters of all abilities, thanks to things like adjustable text size, large buttons, and options for the hearing impaired. Touchscreen ballot markers are best situated to meet the needs of the handicapped and the elderly. Moreover, retaining the touchscreen element that Georgia voters have used for close to 2 decades now will significantly reduce confusion and promote continuity when the new system is implemented. House Bill 316 will enable our state to invest in the most secure, the most accurate, and the most transparent voting machines. It's the legislation that common sense demands, but it is also the legislation that is overwhelmingly supported by about 95 or 94% of election board supervisors, as well as polls have shown almost 80% of the general public. HB 316 will bring our state to the forefront of election technology. It will introduce common sense, straightforward measures that will make sure every eligible vote counts and every eligible voter has a voice. It builds on the success of our old system and incorporates the best practices of modern day. And it is a clear choice, I believe, for Georgia voters, and that's why I brought the bill to you today. I think, Mr. Chairman, it probably would be helpful as we begin this to talk a little bit about voting history in Georgia. Many of you are probably old enough to remember that before the election in Florida in 2000, our voting in the state of Georgia was all over the place. We had systems whereby you could vote on paper. You could vote on the old levers machines that were the size of a refrigerator. We had some where you filled in Scantrons. We had a much varied system in Georgia county by county. After the Florida election of 2000, where we didn't know who the president was for about a month, a decision was made by many states to take another look at their voting system, including Georgia, and that's when we went to the uniform system that we have right now. Then Secretary of State Kathy Cox and Governor Barnes, along with the legislature, purchased the system that we have been using ever since. The SAFE Commission met all last year, put together by then Secretary of State Brian Kemp. He asked me to co-chair that with him. We had 5 or 6 meetings all across the state, had hours and hours of public input, voting directors across the state, reviewed the kind of technology that's out there from the 7 or 8 different vendors, and all that went into the bill that is before you today. It was an overwhelming vote on the SAFE Commission to go with a ballot marking device. Also, Mr. Chairman, just a word about the process moving forward after we take legislative action. We have to take legislative action because the current machines that we have is actually written into our code books. So once we change that as a legislature, and then if it's approved by the governor, then the Secretary of State's office would go through what's commonly referred to as an RFP process, or a request for proposal process. That's where they go out to the multiple vendors, put out a request for them to show their wares and go through a grading process where we would pick a new machine for Georgia. What that normally amounts to is that we have to pass some legislation, and then they have to go through that RFP process to see what's next. The general thoughts are on how we would deploy this in Georgia. As all of you know, in the odd years, that being this year, the year 19, we have municipal elections across the state. Those municipal elections are smaller, usually have less voters, and I think the general thought is the new machines would begin to be deployed during those elections, and it would be a great time to try out the new machinery that we have and implement some of the training. The goal being the 2020 elections to have it deployed obviously all across the state because that's a big presidential election year. Also, many of you know that the governor has suggested budget to accomplish this goal. That I feel like should be plenty based upon the information we gathered from the Safe Commission, not only to buy the new equipment, but also to train and to have maintenance contracts for the machinery as we move forward into the years ahead. I want to also point out to you that the bill before you is somewhat of a bipartisan effort. As I go through it, I will point out to you sections which are actually bills that Democrats introduced into the legislature. We took those bills and incorporated the best ideas that we found, bipartisan measures, into the bill that you have before you, as well as myself, the Speaker Pro Tem, and Majority Leader Burns sat down probably for about 2 hours at one point with the Minority Leader Trammell, the Minority Caucus Chairman Beverly, who also served on the Safe Commission with me, and other Democrats, and we took their thoughts and the things that they thought were important and incorporated it into the bill before you, and I'll try to point those out to you as we go through it. Mr. Chairman, I believe all your subcommittee members have the bill in front of you, and now I'll take you through some of the highlights of that. Most of the bill, it's a long bill, it's over 40 pages or so. Most of it is where we simply have to go in and change the wording in the code because, as I mentioned earlier, the term DRE, the machine that we use now, is in our code in several places. So the majority of the sections of the bill in front of you, 28 out of 52, are doing just that, making it possible to go to that new kind of voting system that I described to you. Some of the sections in particular that I would point out to you, Section 5 of the bill clarifies that registered voters who vote before on an early voting, as long as they turn 18 by election day, they are allowed to vote. That's not currently articulated in our law. Section 7 of the bill is a pretty important section. It deals with the Electronic Registration Information Center system, referred to commonly amongst the state as ERIC. This is an effort for us to upgrade our abilities to maintain our voter rolls. ERIC is a system now a majority of the states and voting jurisdictions are involved with. It's an interstate compact, if you will, that allows states to talk to each other when voters move around the country. For example, I live over in the Augusta area. We have people moving across the Savannah River all the time into North Augusta or Aiken, South Carolina. South Carolina is a member of the ERIC system. So if I moved across the river to North Augusta and I registered to vote, South Carolina would notify the state of Georgia that Barry no longer lives there, and you should update your voting system. We think that's a big improvement to what we have, and then we feel like over a period of time, not only a majority of the states, but even more will belong to that system. Section 9 of the bill provides for a 30-day notice and opportunity to request a hearing prior to a county removing a felon from the rolls. As you know, felons in Georgia are not allowed to vote until their civil rights are restored. We want to always make sure that if someone is taken off the road for that reason, that it is done correctly, and this would allow anyone a process who feels like that they have been taken off inappropriately to have a hearing. Section 11 of the bill. Right now in Georgia, before a voter is no longer on the rolls, it takes almost 8 years of what we call no contact. The federal government requires us as a state, as well as every state, to have a reasonable system to update our voting rolls. It's not our choice if we wanted to or not. We have to maintain good voter lists. The system that we use is one where we expect you to contact us every now and then, and usually that's through voting. Right now, there's about an 8-year window if we never hear from you and you don't vote, that when we update our voter rolls, you may no longer be there. This bill moves that in Section 11 to a 10-year window. Why 10 years? because Georgia, we're one of the states, one of the minority of states actually, but one of the states that have automatic registration when you renew or get your driver's license. So we move it out to the 10 years because that's the time period where people normally in that range will renew their driver's license. Section 13 and 14 of the bill is one of those bipartisan measures that I mentioned earlier. Section 13 and 14 is actually Representative Hobson's HB 299, a bill sponsored by Democrats that addresses an issue that arose in past years. That being, it requires any county that is going to close a polling place to give better notification and have a deadline whereby if they haven't made a decision to move it, when it gets close to election within 60 days, they cannot. I point you next to Section 27 of the bill. Section 27 of the bill is another bipartisan measure that was introduced into the House. House Bill 255, introduced by Democrats and Republicans. It makes clear a problem that exists, we believe, that need clarifying in our code section, once again dealing with people who have been arrested. As we all know, if you are arrested and you're sitting in the county jail, you have not been convicted, you are not a felon, you still have the right to vote. But one part of our absentee ballot process is that when you register to vote, if you want an absentee ballot, that's where it's sent to, your address. This makes it clear that if need be, that an absentee ballot could be sent to a jail if a person were there, and I believe that was Representative Williams's bill that he represented. Next, I would point you to Section 30 of the bill, which simplifies the oath process for an absentee ballot. An elector would just have to sign their name. It removes some of the requirements regarding date of birth and address involved in that process. I would also point you to Section 32 of the bill. This is one of the largest part of the discussions when we sat down with Democratic colleagues and talked about the process of how you deal with absentee ballots that aren't returned properly, or they're returned in such a way that there are problems with it. This requires what is called commonly is a cure period for absentee ballot. You combine that with portions of Section 27 in the bill, and when an absentee ballot comes in, if there are problems with it, now you would reach out to that voter and allow them to correct that problems, and they would have notice that they need to do a little more work. Section 35 of the bill, we make it easier for persons to assist other people who need help voting. We do away with a kind of a little more restrictive part of Georgia law that was there, and we simply move to the federal standard, which says that anyone can assist a voter if they request it, as long as not as their employer or a member of a hierarchy in their union. I mentioned to you several important sections here that I wanted to point out to you. I can't probably stress how important that system of ERIC that I mentioned to you, where we communicate with other states. That seems to be one of the biggest areas, our society being so mobile now. And I should have mentioned to you that the ERIC system was actually a recommendation of the Obama administration for the various states to move to that. And once again, that's Section 7, which is in the bill. Mr. Chairman, I've tried to hit some of the highlights by going through what is a very long bill. Remembering, of course, that most of the bill is just removing code sections referencing our current system so we can employ a new system. I know that there probably will be some questions, so I want to stop there, Mr. Chairman, and certainly try to entertain questions. I will, Mr. Chairman, introduce for the committee the people sitting with me here that can help me answer some of these questions. Ryan Germany is Executive Counsel with the Secretary of State's office, is what I consider a very able attorney in the area of election law. And of course, here with me also Secretary of State Raffensperger, who has been very supportive during this whole process to help us try to craft a bill that helps Georgia move ahead in the voting process. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have or members of the committee.
Very good, and I thank you so much for that presentation. You've got several members here that I think the order of the chair is going to be that we allow the folks that you've got to back you up and to talk and to embellish a little bit more specifics of the bill. And I'll go through these first.
And allow them to come up and talk
Allow
to us,
them
Mr.
come
Chairman.
up first. Lynn Bailey.
Lynn, would you prefer to stand at the podium or come sit over here? Yeah, okay. Well, why don't you stand right there?
Okay.
Ms. Chairman, I appreciate you allowing Lynn to come forward. Ms. Bailey has been the elections director in Augusta, Richmond County for over 25 years, right, Lynn?
Yes.
Yeah. She is an excellent source of information for all the other election directors in the whole part of East Georgia where I live. She was a member of the SAFE Commission that I mentioned earlier, and actually has a leader amongst the people who run elections county by county in the state of Georgia, and has done a good bit of outreach to them on this issue of the next kind of machines that we may use, voting devices we may use in Georgia. And so I appreciate you allowing her to come, and please feel free to go ahead and flesh out that introduction. Thank you for being here, Lynn.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Lynn Bailey, and I'm the Executive Director for the Richmond County Board of Elections. This is a position that I've held for 26 years. I've worked with elections for nearly 40 years in total and have administered both an all-paper voting system and an electronic voting system. In 2001, I was appointed by then Secretary of State, Kathy Cox, to sit on the 21st Century Voting Commission. That commission, much like the 2018 SAFE Commission, was charged with researching and making recommendations for a new voting system in Georgia. In 2003, I accepted a second appointment from then Secretary Cox to serve on the U.S. Election Assistant Commission Standards Board as Georgia's local election official representative, helping to develop national voting system standards and best practices for election administration, a position that I held until recently when I submitted my resignation to Secretary Raffensperger to focus on election matters a little closer to home. Most recently, as a member of Secretary of State's SAFE Commission, I listened to hours of testimony from accessibility, voting rights, and cybersecurity experts, as well as heard comments from the general public and other election officials from across Georgia. SAFE Commission members also heard presentations on different methods of voting, post-election and risk-limiting audits, and saw demonstrations by various voting system vendors on what their systems could offer the state of Georgia. I am an election administrator, and that's the perspective that I bring to you today. House Bill 316 has many, many good features. I'd like to start today with the provisions regarding Georgia's new voting system and begin by clarifying some issues about which I am often asked. Number one, any system that Georgia procures will have a paper component that will be verifiable by the voter before being tabulated. The issue rests with how that paper is marked, by machine or by a human hand. Secondly, either way, whether it's a machine-marked or paper-marked ballot, the tabulation of that ballot will be performed by a machine that uses some type of coding to help the machine read and interpret the markings on the ballot. Tabulation on Election Day and during advance voting will continue to be conducted at the polling place, and tabulation for absentee ballots by mail will continue to be tabulated at a central location within each county. At a minimum, each polling location must provide a voting unit that will allow voters with disabilities to continue to vote their ballot independently and without assistance. As an election official, I would hope that the new system will have robust security features so that any manipulation of the software is easily detected by the users. I also look forward to the implementation of mandatory post-election audits, whereby paper ballots will be compared to machine-counted votes to ensure that the equipment has functioned properly. In order to really make it meaningful, I would suggest that the post-election audit be randomized for counties and that the public be invited to monitor that entire process. Continuing, we fully expect that the current rules and laws for storage and upkeep of equipment will stay firmly in place and will be regularly evaluated for improvement. We hope that the system selected will be in place in time for the 2020 election cycle, will be uniform statewide, will continue to be supported by the Center for Election Systems, will be easy for voters and election officials to use, and will not place a financial burden on counties. During the Safe Commission meetings, we heard from many Georgia citizens passionate about their belief that a system using hand-marked paper ballots was the right choice for Georgia. Likewise, we heard from voting rights activists expressing concerns about hand-marked ballots because of the high likelihood of contests being overvoted, and also from accessibility advocates expressing their concern that if voters with disabilities were the only individuals using the machine-marked ballots, that their ballot would look different from the hand-marked ballots that were in the ballot box, causing them to lose or at least diminish their ability to vote a secret ballot. Election officials have weighed in on their preference for machine-marked ballots, and it's apparent to me that Georgians across the state are very opinionated on this issue. Stated problems with machine-marked ballots included the cost of the system, the desire for a ballot that's completely verifiable by humans and contains no coding, the desire for the voted ballot to be verified by the voters to contain every option on the ballot and not just the races and the name of the candidates for which the voter has actually cast a ballot. As a Safe Commission member, I surveyed my fellow election officials in Georgia to ask a very simple question. What system do you believe would be best for your voters? While the overall results were not completely surprising, the degree to which we agreed was, as Representative Fleming stated, in all, over 95% of the respondents felt that machine-marked ballots was the best method of voting for voters, election administration, and county governments in terms of accuracy of the marked ballot, ease of use by voters, and cost to counties. Stated problems with hand-marked paper ballots included: paper ballots are messy and may contain errant marks, making it appear as though a contest contains an overvote. At the polling place, if a scanner detects an overvote, the ballot will be returned to the voter and they'll be given an opportunity to remark a fresh ballot or either count the ballot like it is. If counted like it is, it will effectively be an overvote and will not register a vote in that particular race. Paper ballots will be expensive for counties. As an example, in my county, Richmond County, we have around 140,000 registered voters. Our line item for ballot printing for the 2018 elections was right at $14,000. My best estimate for 2020, if we go to all paper, will be about $350,000. That's a 2,400% increase in my line item for printing. We believe that since ballot issuance will no longer be an automated process, that additional poll workers will be required to minimize the risk of issuing the wrong ballot, especially during advanced voting, when metro counties will have hundreds of ballot styles that must be provided by party and sometimes by different languages. Likewise, on election day in polling places where there are multiple ballot styles, they would also be manually issued, and again, contemplating party in different languages possibly. Paper ballots take longer to process. We know this from our experiences with absentee ballots and for many of us as administrators of paper balloting prior to the implementation of electronic voting in 2002. Any expectation of quick election results should be tempered when it comes to tabulating paper ballots. It just takes more time to do it. Moving on, there are other provisions in House Bill 316 that are terrific and provide great opportunities for better access, including, but not limited to, the ability, as Representative Fleming stated, the ability to mail a ballot to a different in-county address in the event that a person is incarcerated awaiting trial. Further, there's a provision in there that allows for that individual's ballot and others that has been sent by the mail to be personally delivered to our office by a family member or by a person that lives in the home. As an example, right now, if you as a parent or a spouse want to return the ballot for a child or your spouse, you aren't allowed by law to do that on their behalf unless they're physically disabled. So there are changes in here that opens up the door a little bit to allow for easier return of absentee ballots. It doesn't affect the security involved. We're still verifying signatures and other information on the ballot to make sure that everything is copacetic with the ballot, but it does give more opportunity to get those ballots back in and not have us turn people away that come to our office to return those ballots. The bill also establishes pilot programs giving disabled voters an opportunity to have their ballot delivered to them electronically like we do military now. And this would allow them to use their assistive devices to cast their ballot independently. And also, that same pilot program explores the option of an electronic return of that same voted ballot. House Bill 316 also makes permanent the various court orders issued last year involving signature mismatches with absentee ballots and ballots for absentee ballots and other ballots, and conforms Georgia's voter assistance laws to match existing federal laws, making it easier for voters to receive assistance. It puts stringent requirements in place for us to review provisional ballots, and we need to take a deep dive into that stuff. We need to be mandated to do it, and this law specifies some requirements for doing that. It requires also, I think very importantly, it requires election officials that when a voter registration application is rejected because the information doesn't verify, it mandates that we at a minimum check that application for typos to make sure that our clerk hasn't accidentally entered in wrong information. That's a great provision, and I think it will help a lot. I could go on, but I'll stop for now and close by saying that many of the changes provided in House Bill 316 are insightful, meaningful, and long overdue, including the change to our aging voting system. 2020 will be here before we know it, and there is much to be done to ensure successful implementation. The time frame under which we're currently operating is very similar to the one that we saw in 2001 and 2002. It can be done, but there's no time to waste. You should take solace in the knowledge that your election administrators across the state are, in my opinion, public officials extraordinaire. We are as dedicated and professional as any of election and voter registration law. We want to succeed. We want a positive experience for our voters. And with that, I'll close, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Do we have any questions from any of the committee members, subcommittee members? What's your number? All right, Mr. Drymel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be clear, is this the time to ask about the sections of the bill, or do you just want us to ask questions of the
I think you need
witness?
to direct that to the author of the bill.
So you want us to wait?
Yes, we'll go through the backup testimony, and then we'll go back to Mr. Flampman.
Like, I do have one question for the witness, though. Is it your understanding that the system that is proposed, the voting system that's proposed in House Bill 316, would rely upon some type of code on the actual ballot that would be read and not on the mark itself for which candidate?
It's my opinion that any system that we use, whether it's marked by machine or marked by human hand, will be dependent upon some kind of code to tabulate it. Even on a paper ballot that's marked by hand, there's coding along the outer rim of that piece of paper that helps that machine interpret who gets the vote, the positioning of the mark on the ballot, and who gets that vote. There were some systems that we saw demonstrated that took so the slip you would get out of the machine on a machine-marked ballot would have listed upon it the name of the race and the name of the candidate that you selected in a particular race. Some systems we saw buttoned up that information that's printed on the card and put it into a QR code or a barcode that was then actually scanned and tabulated, and that's how the tabulation occurs. Does that answer your question?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might, I'm just trying to figure out what system this bill relies on or would permit. Does it permit that barcode? I mean,
it would. That's my opinion. That may be a question better for Representative Fleming, but I think it basically provides for a ballot that's marked by machine instead of a ballot that is marked by human hand. As to the tabulation portion of it, that may be a question for other experts.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, in response to the minority leader's question, one of my thought processes in putting the bill together is that because there are 7 or 8 different vendors out there that offer all kind of different options, that we should not have the bill limit those options. In other words, that's what the RFP process is for, when you go out there and see who can give you the best equipment for the best price that will do the best job for us. I'm sure that vendor A would like for us to draw it where vendor B couldn't compete for George's business. And I'm sure vendor C would like for us to eliminate other vendors, but we tried not to do that in the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the point is made. I mean, what I just want to make sure is that I think it was presented as the paper ballot that you mark by hand, and the paper ballot generated by a ballot marking device is an apples to apples comparison. And I don't think that's dependent upon what technology is used that's generated by the ballot marking device. Is that fair?
Well, rest assured, I'm not sure I understood your question, but rest assured that there's this many different possibilities for kind of different kinds of technology out there. And so you name it and you can just about get it from one of those 8 vendors, because even vendor A, for example, will give you 7 different options of how you can craft, you know, what was that old Burger King thing, have it your way? There's all kind of options out there.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might, but isn't it true that the types of issues that you would have to account for in statute and law vary depending upon whether you're talking about a ballot that is generated by a ballot marking device with the barcode, as opposed to whether you were talking about a system where you had a hand-marked paper ballot? The considerations that you would want to address in the law would be different.
If you wanted to restrain the possibilities of the vendors we could go with and the type of machine we could select, you absolutely could draw that into the law. But once again, our goal was not to eliminate any of those possibilities from the different vendors. The simple requirement in the bill is it does give an overall style, that being a ballot marking device that puts it on a piece of paper that will then be scanned in. And given that limited approach, there's still 8 different companies that can give you 8 different versions of how that might work.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I mean, I think this cuts fundamentally to the core of the issue. But you know what I'm trying to figure out is, what is the ballot?
The ballot is a piece of paper, Mr. Leader.
In the definition under the code at line 49, if you look at what the definition, the statutory definition of the ballot, it's the paper, it's mechanical, or it's electronic. And the concern I have is that if it's not just the paper and we're opening the door to the electronic, and we don't know what kind of system will be implemented at the end of the RFP process, we don't really know what the ballot is.
Mr. Leader, if you'll show me in here where it says the paper is not the ballot, we'll try to change it.
Line 49 in current code, the definition of official ballot.
What do you want to change?
I would like to change it to say official ballot means a paper ballot.
We'll make a note of that and look at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Williams. All right, Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Ms. Bailey, if you don't mind, I have a
Yes,
question
yes,
for
sure.
you. And
Thank you.
thank you first and foremost for your service to the Safe Commission and your perspective today. How many you mentioned during your testimony that there were cyber security experts that testified, and I believe there was at least one that was on the committee. How many of cyber security experts did you guys hear from?
I guess primarily it was the one who was Dr. Lee with Georgia Tech. There were other documents that were presented, other reports that were presented to Safe Commission members kind of as a sidebar, sent from outside individuals that weren't directly submitted through the commission itself.
Any of those reports have a preference? Any of the cybersecurity experts have a preference for one methodology for marking the ballots over another?
The cybersecurity experts that we heard from preferred a hand-marked ballot for the most part.
Thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. Is that it, Mr. Turner?
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Looks like we have several members that have their own fan clubs here today. So-
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I want to clarify the leader's question earlier. Council reminded me that we're going to change the code today, for example, this legislative session. but there will be special elections held across the state for SPLOST, for various vacancies that may occur, and you still will have your current DRE machines out there doing that. So you have to leave that possibility in the code so we don't outlaw the use of those machines until the new ones are put in. I understand your question though, but that's why we can't change it in the location where you specified. I'll get back to you on that.
And Mr. Chairman, what I would say is that we could have an effective date that that particular part of the law goes into effect in the future, which would completely address that and allow president elections to proceed under the current
But then you
code.
would disallow the ability for us to, in the municipal elections in 19 in November, to use the new machines. So that when we pass the law this year, you have to account for the fact that you're still going to be using the DREs in some municipal elections and also in special elections that may occur between now and then because of vacancies in office. And you also have to allow for the use of the new machines that we're going to buy. So the definition has to be large enough to encompass both.
That it? Thank you, Mr. Trammell. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bailey, I want to thank you for all your years of hard work.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I spent about 16 of those years with you.
Yes, you did.
Have you ever had trouble, and I've never asked you this before, in Richmond County with the DREs?
Yeah, we have not. You have the occasional machine that might freeze up or something like that. Most of those situations have been curable by rebooting the equipment. I have never had any reason to question the election results. All the pre-election testing we've ever done was spot on. I've never had any reasons to suspect that there was, that anyone had done something wrong with our software or manipulated it in any way. So all in all, I think the machine, the system has performed accurately and quite well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may. When the polls closed at 7 and all of the cards, memory cards and everything was brought in, how quick were you able to tabulate your results?
Well, quite quickly, because the election results were just a matter of putting in a memory card. It still continues to be the case. Perhaps any system you go to, the paper ballots, the ones that we process now that come through the mail, are generally the holdup on election night. Those are the ones that take more time and effort to process, and are typically, it's not uncommon for them to be the very last things that we're able to count.
Mr. Chairman, if I may continue.
Certainly.
When you get a provision or a mail-in absentee ballot and you feed it through the machine to tabulate it, and it kicks it back, what is the process that you go through then? Can you explain that for everyone?
I will. The process, first of all, starts, it will kick back if the machine detects an overvoted ballot, an overvoted race. And that could be because the voter has deliberately voted for more than one person, or maybe they drug their pencil out or pen down the page accidentally, and the machine has perceived an overvote. With the mail-in ballots, because the voter is not present, there's a committee that reviews that ballot and determines what they think was the voter's intent in casting their ballot. That ballot is then duplicated onto a fresh ballot to reflect the voter's intent.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today. I'd like for you to, if you don't mind, walk back through your concern with the increased cost at a local, at a county level. Did you say currently you're only spending approximately $17,000?
Actually, I said for 2018, our line item for printing was about $14,000. Now, in Richmond County and some of the other counties around the state, we do have a printing system, a ballot on demand printing system, which would certainly be highly recommended if we move to paper, that allows us to print the number of mail-out ballots that we actually need. And that's a good position to be in, so we don't have to have a bunch of ballots ahead of time that will then go to waste per se. There are some, of course, but in most jurisdictions around the state, they don't have that. They have to order enough ballots to accommodate what they think voters will need. As we look towards 2020 and the possibility of paper balloting, I think we would be prudent. It's a presidential election year. You have no idea of knowing what turnout's going to be. That we would almost be compelled to order 100% or close to it of the ballots that would be required on both parties' ballots in a primary, and then you have to contemplate the nonpartisan ballot, and that would be for every single precinct that's out there. So rather than our using 7,000 or 8,000 ballots during an election, we would be using 250,000 or so in a primary situation.
At what expected cost?
For us, our expected cost our line item would increase from 2018, which was about $14,000, to an anticipated cost of about $350,000 for the year in 2020. And might I just add, if you don't mind, that is a cost that's traditionally borne by the counties, that type of expense. The state does not participate in the cost of printed ballots for counties. We are on our own with that.
Thank you. That's my question. Thank you.
Representative Gravely.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. The committee, to reference Representative Williams' line of questioning, the committee to review overvoted or questionably marked ballots.
Yes.
How is that? Who makes up that committee, and how are those members submitted or appointed?
It's a bipartisan committee. The election superintendent appoints a person. Each major political party has a representative there. And when there are nonpartisan candidates on the ballot, the chief judge of the Superior Court has 2 appointees to that vote review panel. So it's a good, it's set up by design to be an odd number. It's set up by design that the election official's representative to the board has the final, can be the tiebreaker on the board, and it is bipartisan. You're welcome.
Is that it, Mr. Gravely?
Yes, sir.
All right. Any other questions from any of the subcommittee members? If you would, will you be around in case there's some other questions that are posed?
Yes, sir.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Secretary of State Raffensperger, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Chairman Powell and committee members, it's a pleasure to be here to have the opportunity to testify on behalf of a bill that brings real progress and common sense reforms to our voters. Over the last 2 decades, Republicans have taken the lead in overcoming our state's history of voter issues in favor of voting reforms that have enabled more accessible and more fair elections for our state. Republican-led initiatives like automated voter registration, online voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, and early voting have led to drastic improvements in voter registration and voter turnout, particularly over the last 4 election cycles. I'm honored to take up the mantle of progress for House Bill 316, which is only the next step in opening the door further to better access and more democratic participation for every eligible voter in our state. Everyone here agrees that we should continue to guarantee ballot access to every eligible voter while protecting election integrity and prioritizing transparency. We all agree that our state's 17-year-old election system must be updated to achieve these goals. As we approach the 2020 elections, it is clear that our state should build on the best aspects of our current system and integrate new advances in technology. We should create a cost-effective solution that balances security, accessibility, and transparency. Above all, as my duty as Secretary of State is to expand access to elections with common sense reforms that inspire confidence and promote participation. The legislation before you today is the result of recommendations from the Bipartisan, Secure, Accessible, and Fair Elections Commission, which held meetings across the state for almost a year with security experts, academics, county election boards, elected officials, and the general public. After exhaustive study, the Commission recommended a series of guidelines for the new state election system and the best practices which set the foundation for House Bill 316. House Bill 316 represents a smart solution for our state, not only with a new, deliberately designed election system, but also with a series of new reforms crafted to make voting easier and better for every registered voter. This is a voter-centric piece of legislation which at its core looks for common sense ways to expand access and ease of voting. Chairman Fleming has already reviewed the finer details of touchscreen marked paper ballots, which are the best option if we are to promote election integrity and long-term cost-effective solutions. The other reforms in HB 316 include new guidelines for voter roll maintenance that will guarantee more of Georgia's voters are kept on the rolls for longer periods of time, so that even those who vote infrequently will be able to cast a ballot when they like. A significant new authorization will allow us to share vital voter information with other member states through the Electronic Registration Information Center, that's known as ERIC, so that we are better able to track those who have moved, are deceased, who are felons, shoring up existing security protocols and preventing bad actors from infiltrating our elections. And for new registrants, HB 316 mandates new safeguards that will cut back on human error in the identification verification process that local election boards conduct in conjunction with the Department of Driver Services. Overall, these are common sense reforms that give more registered eligible voters greater opportunity to vote while ensuring that our state is still protected against security risk. Today, Georgia has a record number of registered voters, with a 15% increase in active voters over the last 2 years and a 24% increase in minority participation or registration. For each election, we continue to break turnout records. It is clear that we should build on the success of our current system and policies and enable continued growth with better electoral future. Our state has been on a bright path forward, and this is only the first step towards a fairer, more robust democracy. Simply put, this is good policy that will continue to propel Georgia in the right direction. Our founders paid a high price for our rights to cast a ballot, and I take that burden extremely seriously. It is my honor to continue fighting for every Georgian's right to vote and their right to feel confident that we as a state got it right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I will stand for any questions the committee may have.
Secretary, I appreciate that. Any questions? Any questions from the subcommittee members? Representative Trammell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. And I want to ask, in your position as Secretary of State, do you have a position on what the voting mechanism that Georgia should adopt would be?
It is my belief that the best system moving forward, the most accurate and the most secure would be a ballot marking device, a machine-marked paper ballot with touchscreen technology.
And, Mr. Chairman, if I might follow up, does that mean you've made the determination that the state of Georgia should not pursue a hand-marked paper ballot?
It is my position that hand-marked paper ballots are not as secure, and I would prefer, and the General Assembly will make the ultimate decision, but I believe that a machine-marked paper ballot system is the most secure system, because we don't have to then try to cipher what voter intent was. And I think that is what makes me feel much more comfortable moving forward.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the concern, did you follow the Safe Commission testimony?
I did.
The concerns that were expressed by cybersecurity experts, have you given thought about how your office would put regulations into place if we adopted a ballot marking device to account for their concerns?
Well, I was on the Safe Commission. I became a member at the end. And one of the questions that I had to Professor Wenke Lee was that he kept on talking, it was really two conversations in one. And in that, what I mean by that is he talked about hand-marked paper ballot, and then he started talking about how it would be scanned. At the end of the day, as Miss Bailey just said, that at the end of the day, whether you go with hand-marked paper ballot or a machine-marked paper ballot, it will be optically scanned with virtually the same machine based on who the vendor is. So the question really is, should it be hand-marked where you could have stray marks, or it should be a machine-marked where there won't be the stray marks? I believe that it makes more sense to have it machine-marked so we know there will not be stray marks on it. Once you make your selections, you press the button, you would print out that ballot, and then the voter can review that ballot, make sure that they got it right. And if they got it right, then they can take the 3 to 5 steps over to the optical scanner. They put it on the optical scanner, and that's where the ballot will be counted.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask him about a different section? You testified a little bit about the ERIC system. I think that's in section, believe
Section 7, I believe.
7 in the bill.
If you could cut the lights back up or either cut the music on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in section 7, the question I have, and I think ERIC is a good system for what it's worth. The question I have about section 7 and the language in there is why we don't spell out ERIC specifically, and why we use the more broad generic term that the Secretary of State may become a member of a non-governmental entity whose purpose is to share and exchange information, da-da-da-da-da. Why don't we just say that we'll do ERIC?
Well, at the present time, the only system that we feel gives the robust and accurate answers is ERIC. But down the road, there may be another information system that comes along and would be equally robust and accurate. So it seemed to us to just make that more of a general, but that's the direction that we're headed.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might, but you don't have another thing in mind as
No.
we're here today. So
No.
would
Correct.
you have objection if we just said ERIC?
It would depend on the will of the committee and the chairman.
Okay.
But that would be our intent. There's no other system out there that would give us the accuracy and the confidence.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, there's another section in this bill that we haven't talked about, but I think is under is section 20, line 403, and it's about the number of voting machines per group of electors. Under present law, we have to have
200.
one machine for 200, and this bill contemplates going up so that now it's one machine for 250 electors. And my question is, don't you think that would exacerbate the problem of lines in areas that have had a problem with lines and not enough machines to process the voters?
It is my understanding that the issue with the lines was not the 200 versus the 250. It was actually in several places machines that had been taken out of service because of some of the age of the machines. So we felt that the number was 200 with 250 was appropriate with the speed of the new technology.
So I just want to make sure I understand, Mr. Chairman, that the reason for going to 200 to 250 is you think these machines are faster than the machines that we have now?
We also will not have the maintenance issues that we have currently right now.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask about one final section of the bill, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence, but this is really about 12 bills in one. In section 42 of the bill, we've talked about election processes on how voters vote and voting machines, but section 42 has a provision in lines 1217 through I think 12 on the final page to line 1255 about a recount provision.
Mm-hmm.
And as I read this language, it would change the eligibility of a recount from 1% to 0.5% in the margin. And I'm just wondering what the rationale on that is.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, in response to the leader's question, that is what several of the other states use now with the modern technology that they have. You also got to remember that you're going to institute in this bill an audit process. Will there be, we feel, more accuracy and more assuredness in the outcome of the election? You also have to realize when that was put in the code, Georgia wasn't, I guess, 11 million people. the amount of voters that we have now and the size of each district, that number of voters at 0.5 represents rather than 1%, I should say 0.05 rather than 1%, is actually still a closer election than it would have been years ago when that was put in the code.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might, is there some, I understand what the gentleman's saying, but it depends, this would cover any election, no matter how many voters voted in it, whether you were talking about a statewide or whether you're talking about, you know, a House primary where
Just as the current law does, yes.
1,000. And I'm just wondering, you know, has there been some issue with the 1%?
The issue
I
is
feel like I'm missing, I got to be missing something on this. What am I missing?
Just listen to me.
I'm listening.
I know you are. It's with the growth in population, as we've had in Georgia, and that's for the change of percentage, and you see that reflected in the trend in the states now. States that used to have that percentage are moving to the percentage that's in our bill. It's simply something that had been there for a long time that is now being updated, noting the growth of our state. You know, 1% in a House race, and I'm just throwing figures out here, you know, now would be over 600 votes. If the next go around, we're close to 60,000. Whereas if you look when that number was probably put in there, you know, 1% would have been, you know, maybe out of 20,000 people would have been how many? 200 folks. So the 0.5% is actually greater than it was when that number was put in the code to start with.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might just make a request of the Secretary's office, I'd just be interested in information about how many times this provision as it exists in present law has been used. If
How often are recounts
how
triggered?
often are we doing recounts?
Sure.
That's right.
Sure, I can ask them to look at that for you.
Thank you,
Finished,
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trammell? Good deal. Ms. Williams?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I have a follow-up question about the number of machines. How many I mean, there were certainly long waits in Cobb County. How many machines were in use in the 2018 elections? I mean, I know you weren't in office, but do you have a feel for that? I mean, what was the...
Cobb County specifically represented?
Well, generally speaking, what was the ratio, would you say, if you're talking about going from 250 to 200 per person?
Yeah,
What do you think the ratio?
I know the Cobb County, I think elections director is here, Mr. Chairman. Is that person not here? Yeah. Could she be allowed to come up to answer that, Mr. Chairman?
Would you rather ask the lady questions?
I'm happy with whoever can answer the questions, Mr. Chairman. So it's your.
If you would, please.
If you would introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Janine Evler. I'm the Director of Elections for Cobb County. And if you would repeat your question, please.
My question is, there's language in this bill which would reduce the ratio of machines per person to from 200 well, I'm sorry, I'm not getting it right. 200, go from 250 to 200 machines. And I'm just, excuse me, I've got it backwards. I'm sorry. But so I was wondering what the ratio was in Cobb, because there were certainly lines in Cobb.
Yes, that's true. There were. The code section, I believe, says per precinct and not per polling place, if I'm not mistaken. And the precincts, you have to divide out all of your precincts into the number that you're using for early voting and election day. And we had fewer on election day than we would have liked, because we did have almost 550 units that were under sequestration due to a court order. So we could only work with what we had left.
So I guess what I'm asking is, would this reduced number of machines impact lines in Cobb, do you think?
I don't think so. This is just speculation based on what we've seen so far, but I did a calculation on 250 per precinct, and it ranged up to, the largest precincts had 25 units, and I think the lowest precincts were around 6. That's sort of where we have touchscreens today. in the best case when we have all of our units available to us.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I had one more question for the Secretary. So, thank you. So I was wondering, I know you weren't in office, but do you happen to know how many absentee ballots were rejected in the November 2018 elections?
We can get that for you, is what the staff is telling us. They'll work on that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This could be for anybody who feels like answering there in the front row. Has anyone with a cybersecurity background expressed concerns about security with electronic ballot markers to you, other than the member on the SAFE Commission?
To me personally, no.
Has there been any interest in finding out from other cybersecurity experts what the potential security pitfalls would be with electronic marking devices?
Let me ask you that. The Secretary was pointing out to me that 24 states are using the type of machine that we're talking about using here. There was an interesting discussion that went on in the SAFE Commission with Dr. Lee, and he made comments referring to other cybersecurity experts across the nation. I read a letter that was sent to me by, I think, I can't remember if it's a dozen or more election experts, and they did mention a preference toward the hand-marked ballots. They, however, in that same letter, Representative, indicated that people with disabilities would have to use a different kind of machine if we went to the hand-marked paper ballots. One of the biggest concerns that we have in this area of treating people differently because of their disabilities and requiring them to use a different machine is the fact that we also have to comport this with Americans with Disabilities Act. I think the testimony that we had was that our goal is to get the most efficient system possible across the board with the most security, but it is a balance between the two, and then you have to balance it with cost, and you also have to balance it with Americans with Disabilities Act. So one of the benefits of the system that seemed to be even admitted by some of the cyber experts that want you to go with the hand-marked paper ballot is that you are going to have two different standards for people, which generally is not allowed under the law, and we think we would be setting ourselves up to be challenged on that. You know, the other thing that that Dr. Lee talked about a lot on the SAFE Commission was the cost. And one thing that has been calculated since then, and you heard some of it today, would be that by the time that you buy the system up front, like we're talking about with the ballot marking devices, it may cost more on the front end, but by the time you turn a paper ballot system over to the local governments, and the millions it would cost to do that over the years of the life of the system, you probably are going to find it to be a wash. So his idea was twofold. One, that it would cost more to go this way, and his idea on security discounted the fact that the voter themselves gets to look at the piece of paper, and this is what I mean by that. Dr. Lee seemed to say that if I fill it out with an oval with a pencil, that I would be sure who I voted for. When we said to him, but in the system with a ballot marking device, you get to get a piece of paper in your hand, and I can see if it says Representative Scott Turner, that's your check to make sure that the ballot marking device did the right, because he was talking about somebody possibly tampering with the ballot marking device. His response to that was he feared people wouldn't look at who they voted for. And the only thing I can say to that is that there comes a certain level of responsibility for everything we do in society. You need to properly register to vote. You have to have the gumption to go either request an absentee ballot, either go early vote, or go down to the polls and vote. You also probably need to have the responsibility of looking at the piece of paper that was printed out, if you want to see that you voted for the person you voted for. So those were the two things that Dr. Lee talked about most, the cost, which I think he was wrong on because of the discussion we just had, and also the fact that he was saying that people won't look at the ballot that was printed for them before they cast it. I disagree with that. I think certainly they don't have to if they don't want to, but in our lengthy discussions on that, that's what it narrowed down to.
If I may, Mr. Chairman. How will the ballots be loaded onto the electronic ballot marking devices?
You come into the polling place. You say which, they have to determine which ballot you want, and then that will be loaded into the machine, not exactly like now, but it will pop up giving you the people that you vote for. And obviously the understanding is that particularly in early voting, my county of Columbia County with 150, 60,000 people will have multiple different ballots. So in some ways, the voter won't see, I think, too much different than what he sees now. Some of that, however, goes into what I said, that wide variety of choices that are out there by different vendors. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. But I'm curious if we've contemplated the chain of custody with how ballots are loaded, if that's a potential failure or a weak spot in the security of loading a ballot onto an electronic ballot marking device.
If you're suggesting, which I think you might be, that someone could try to tamper with that, people will always be in the system, and there will always be the possibility for flaws, even in the hand-marked paper ballots. You just heard a second ago testimony from someone who's been doing elections for 25 years. You got a pencil, you can mess with somebody's ballot if it's a hand-marked paper ballot. So the other side of it is that when you run both the piece of paper, whether it's hand-marked or a ballot marking device, through the scanning device, there's, of course, another opportunity for a person with nefarious motives to try to interfere with the system. So, unfortunately, because humans are going to be involved, you're never going to completely be able to remove that from the system. What you want to do is design a system that balances that with the ability for voters to vote efficiently, quickly, and also for it to be a system that is affordable by the local governments and the state.
So, Mr. Chairman, would you agree with me when I say this, that there are problems with both hand-marked paper ballots and ballot marking devices?
I would go even further to say that with the variety of different types of systems that we saw, that every system has the potential for some problems and some vulnerabilities.
So how would we limit our risk?
We limit our risk from the audit that we have in the bill, and also that you have been such a huge proponent of. There is in the bill a process for after the election for there to be an audit. There could be different versions of that audit, but one that was quite often discussed in the Safe Commission would be maybe randomly per county one precinct was picked. And because of the nature of the paper ballot system that we're talking about going to, you could see, double check, that the votes in that precinct match the ones that were reported through an audit.
Thank you.
I also have some questions about audits and cybersecurity. What mechanisms would be in place to protect against malware?
Malware?
Yes.
Well, malware. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm an ignorant savage. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That was part of this. Yeah, that was part of the discussion that we just had. I mean, the poll workers right now are in charge of keeping the systems secure. Many of the systems that we saw that are available have non-conventional ports, so to speak. In other words, when we think of iPhones, we can all plug into the same type port, generally speaking, if you have an iPhone like I do. Several of the systems that we saw don't have that. The plugins that someone would try to tap into the system are completely different than what you could buy anywhere unless you specifically had the key to get into that system. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Not exactly, but I'm sure it's close enough. So another question, if you find that some of the voting machines that you're looking at or that are being proposed have lost certification by the Electoral Assistance Commission, would they be knocked out of consideration?
You want to answer that one?
Yes, we would require any systems to be certified by EAC.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions of the Secretary? If not, we're going. Yes, Mr. Trammell. We're gonna give you all your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, this is a very important subject matter to all of Georgia. I just want to follow up on the question that Representative Williams asked. And and you indicated that any certification would be part of the Elections Assistant Commission. Is that in the bill, or is that something we can put in the bill if it's not in the bill?
That's already in state law, council tells me.
Do you have a site?
We'll get you a site.
Is that it? All right, if there's no more questions of the secretary, we'll get on back onto the list. We have Rick Fulton, Barrow County.
Rick Barron from Fulton County.
Oh, Rick Barron, Fulton County. Excuse me, you got
Mis-
the
Mr.
names
Mi-
all.
Mis- Mr. Chairman, I hand wrote that. No wonder you can't read it. If I'd only typed it out, you would have got it right.
Mr. Barron.
Good afternoon, Richard Barron from Fulton County, and I'm here to speak in favor, at least on the part of the bill that deals with the ballot marking devices. I think right now that's the best way for us to go. In Fulton County, we have expanded early voting so greatly over the years that if we were to go to a system with all paper, you have to provide all of those ballot styles at every early voting site. And I have been a part of conducting elections in which you do that. One of the major problems that you have is that poll workers will end up giving out the incorrect ballots, because you have to have stacks in a big container with all of the ballot styles available at every early voting site. Currently, we had up to 27 early voting sites going in the presidential in 2016. You would have to have enough paper at all of those to make sure that anyone can vote anywhere in the county. We estimate just for any of the large elections that we'd probably have to order at least 1.2 million ballots for our 780,000 voters, registered voters, including the inactive, because you have to have enough ballots for them to vote. You have to have an election day supply. You have to have an early voting supply. You also have to secure those paper ballots during early voting. If we were to keep that, I think having those early voting ballots out there, if you had them all paper, you will have a great risk of somebody. Of course, you'd be able to see if somebody got in through a seal, but those paper ballot containers are going to be out in the early voting locations, and it's much easier to secure the ballot marking devices than it is the paper. At $1.2 million, or 1.2 million ballots, that would cost Fulton County approximately $550,000 per election. If it went up from there with our population growth, that's a big number to add on to our current expenses already. And over time, at least with the ballot marking devices, you're able to you don't have to buy ballot stock. So the printers, the reams or the paper stock is much cheaper. From there, you only print the ballots that you need. You aren't ordering a lot of ballots that will then end up being put in storage at the end that are unused. The other thing is that I think with the post-election audit is a good idea. I don't know, whatever form it takes. One that I was familiar with, the Secretary of State's office in a former state in which I worked would pick 3 to 4 precincts at random and 2 to 3 races at random, and each county would then hand count or machine count depending on how the Secretary of State ordered it, and we would then conduct an audit that way. And within the uniform voting system, I think there needs to be an allowance for a county such as the size of Fulton to have high-speed scanners for the absentee by mail. Currently, because of the way the uniform voting system law is read, we have to read all of our paper ballots one by one through scanners in Fulton. And when you have 30,000 and you have maybe 30 working scanners, it takes forever for us to do that. As far as I would like to see the ratio, the 200-to-1 ratio would be better for me, for our county, especially if you have an election such as the one that we just had in 2018. That ballot was so long that people were standing in line, because when you have especially all of these amendments and other things that are on there, and if people haven't read them before they get into the voting booth, it takes a long time for them to go through those. So I can take any questions.
Mr. Turner.
Tap, tap. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Just a quick question. You mentioned the cost of the paper and having to secure the paper. Isn't it possible to have some sort of ballot print on demand that would solve these issues?
Yeah, you can do print. You can do ballot on demand. I think what happens with ballot on demand is you have to have these commercial style printers that work with ballot stock. So you're going to have at least a couple of those in the precinct. You're also going to have at least spares, whether they're in the precinct or riding around with a technician that's going to be out in the field during the day. One thing you try to avoid is complicating the life of poll workers, and printer maintenance isn't one of the best things to put onto poll workers. We currently now, just when we set up for early voting, we have our IT department go out, we put the computers into the field, we set the printers up that print off the absentee ballot applications. You can turn those on, and if any of the drivers have updated overnight from Microsoft, it can switch the print drivers, and then the printers are offline.
But aren't ballot marking devices essentially printers with a touch screen that we're touching? I mean,
But
they're
yes,
you're going to have that challenge with a poll worker anyway, aren't you?
Yes, but you would have many more in the site during early voting to contend with that. So, and plus they don't quite have the weight. The ballot printers that we use, for example, with Ballotar, where we print ballots to mail out for absentee, those are big commercial printers that you have to load onto carts, and they weigh in excess of 1,000 pounds.
But aren't there companies who do print on demand that just use an off-the-shelf Lexmark or HP printer?
Probably depend on what kind of ballot stock you wanted to use.
Thank
yes.
you, sir. Appreciate your testimony.
All righty, let's see. Mr. Galley.
Thank you for being here. In your experience, when the lines are long at a facility, at a precinct or a polling place, are the machines all full and everyone has their card ready to go in, or is the delay somewhere else in the process?
Sometimes the delay can be sometimes at the check-in process, and if that's the case, the machines will be empty.
What do you see more often in your experience?
Well, I think in Georgia, I see more that it gets. Usually it gets caught up at the check-in center. I think in this last election, it was a combination of both because the ballot was so long.
So the 250 to 200 change, if the bottleneck is actually on them receiving their card in the check-in process, and there are machines still available that aren't being used because the backlog is there, the bottleneck is there, do you see that really being an issue with the number of machines?
I guess it would depend on if you're talking about a general election with a lot of referendum and amendments on it. It's probably not going to matter. In the smaller elections, it's going to be at the poll book where people check in. That's going to be mostly where the delay is. And there's a way to get around that delay. There's technology out there where you can check voters in 20 to 30 seconds, but we have the system, especially that we use in early voting, it takes probably 3 minutes to check in a voter, and we could probably cut that down 5 times over with the right technology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and the Fulton County Elections Director can comment on this. I'm talking to you down here now.
Oh.
Trying to keep you on your toes. We were reminded by the Secretary of State staff when they did that calculation on moving from 200 machines to 250 that we've been discussing. There was a realization that with the use of the DREs, the ones you use in early voting, you can't use on election day because they actually store the votes. That's not the situation with the ballot marking device. So part of that calculation went into not only the technology, which could be, I guess, for lack of better terms, quicker, but also you can use 100% of the machines on election day, thus making that ratio much more suitable and not having the state over purchase and having machines sit around, just like you said, not being used.
Okay, I was unaware of that.
Mr. Williamson. Mr. Williams.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard testimony talking about how much it costs to print the ballots for an election, but no one's mentioned when you have runoffs. So you have the runoff, so you're going to have to go and reprint to get that same election. How many runoffs do you average having in Fulton County in your elections? I know your mayoral race, was a runoff.
Yeah, we had a runoff for the primary this year, and we also had a runoff in December for the general election. So we had 2 runoffs this year, and
so one election, if you said cost you roughly $550,000, cost you over $1 million just for printing for that one election, counting the general election and the runoff.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, it would cost us well over $2 million in ballot costs because you not only, in case if voters spoil ballots because they make mistakes when they hand mark it, then you have to order for the spoilage on top of having at least one for everyone in each precinct.
So the cost could continue to just go up and up and up.
Yes.
Because it costs just as much to print just part of a ballot as it does the whole ballot.
Yeah, and the other thing is that the ballot marking devices prevents overvoting, which is another advantage to those.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's see, Mr. Trammell. Our view.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Representative Turner asked this question. I just want to make sure I understood it, though. When you're talking about these printing costs, you're not talking about the cost if you were using ballot-on-demand printing.
Correct.
And the ballot-on-demand printing would be substantially cheaper. It might require some additional technology, but you wouldn't spend $2 million if you could do ballot-on-demand printing, would you?
It's about 45 cents a ballot if you order the ballots in a large quantity. Depending on the ballot, depending on the company and how much you're going to print. I think for Ballotar, we pay something around 65 cents per ballot So it does cost more per click, but, and then you do have to maintain those printers.
All right, let's see, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to shift us a little bit and come off of ballot marking devices, if that's okay. There's two parts of the bill that I'd like to get your feelings on, given your experience. First is absentee by mail. We are removing in this bill, or at least it's suggested, that we remove basically the requirement to put the elector's residence address and the elector's birth date, or birth year, pardon me. Do you feel as if that will affect the efficacy?
No, I mean, when the ballot comes back to us, the main consideration for us is whether it has the signature, that it matches up to the signature on the absentee ballot application or the voter registration application. So if the signature is there, that's fine with us.
So the signature is the primary driver
Yes,
to determine
for
the
Fulton County,
for Fulton County.
Yes.
Okay. And then the second question I have, Mr. Chairman, I guess, is inside of the bill, and you may not have it in front of you, but for those of you looking, I'm looking at lines 776 through 778. We are removing this language. So removing. Georgia law provides in subsection B of Code Section 212409 that no person shall assist more than 10 electors in any primary election or runoff in which there is no federal candidate on the ballot. So I read that, sir, as if someone could sit around at the local rec department and help 1,000 people. Now, does that cause an efficacy issue?
For me, my experience is I've seen this type of law in other states where there's a limit on the number of people that you can assist. How that's not going to affect the way that we administer the elections, but I've seen this type of limit in other states.
But have you seen, you're saying you've seen the limit in other states, have you seen the removal of that limit?
I haven't, no, but it's been a while since I worked in it somewhere else.
Okay, thank you very much.
May I, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, may I? To Representative Jones, very good question about the change in the people and how you can assist folks with voting. One of the things that was done in this bill was to obviously monitor the court decisions across the state, the nation, as to how federal laws were being interpreted. The idea there is that is the federal standard that we are adopting here in Georgia. And the thought process was that we were probably waiting for someone to challenge us on that if we did not go ahead and make that change, given some of the other court cases that were going on across the nation. So that's really an effort to comport with a standard that we know is acceptable versus keeping one that probably likely would fall under challenge. Daggum lawyers. Yeah.
Yes, go right ahead.
Chairman Fleming, thank you very much for that explanation. Has there been, it's not Chairman Fleming?
He thought what I said was funny. Yeah.
I thought you said Chairman Funny.
Oh.
Yeah.
I have no comment. But Chairman Fleming,
Yes.
has there been a consideration by you, the Secretary of State, and others about possibly moving it from 10 to, say, 50?
Let me let council respond to that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Jones. Ryan Germany, General Counsel and Secretary of State's office. So just to correct one thing that Chairman Fleming said, we actually have been challenged on that law. There was a lawsuit filed, and we lost. So, we need to update this to be in compliance with an existing court order. If we don't update it, the court order is still going to, get rid of that provision. So this is really just updating our law to comply with an existing court order. And I'll point out too that in almost every election, there is a federal candidate on the ballot. So that 10 elector limit does not apply to, the November general elections where there's always federal candidates, primaries where there's federal candidates, runoffs where there's federal candidates. So I don't think it will be a large change in practice. It's more of a legal change.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Germany.
Very good, thank you. All right, do we have any other questions from any of the committee members for Mr. Barron? Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Ms. Janine Evler from Cobb County. Welcome back to the podium.
Thank you very much. Well, I was just notified today that I would be doing this, so I do have a few remarks. Just to clarify one thing on the ballot on demand with printers at the polling places. Most of the products that we saw from vendors that had a print on demand of a blank ballot that could be then hand marked required an independent power supply. And you always want to be careful that the product that you're buying has a battery backup, and a regular printer does not. So those required to be plugged into the wall. You lose power at your polling place, you have no way to print a ballot. So I'm all in favor of ballot on demand printing, which the ballot marking device is a form of that, although it's not a blank ballot. But the devices that we saw from various vendors had battery backups, so that in an emergency you could still function with your either ballot marking device, or if there was a product, which I didn't see, which would be a blank ballot printer. Okay. I also have just some of the same comments to share from my county's perspective. Obviously, we are also in favor, as are most election officials, of the ballot marking devices over the hand-marked paper ballots. And as others have said, while the initial hardware output or cost for the hand-marked paper ballot option would be less, the counties would bear the burden of ongoing per election operating costs. And last year in 2018, our ballot printing costs were a total of $87,000 for all of the elections in 18. And if we were to use the same contracts and requirements, our estimated costs for 2020 election cycle would be over $1 million, which is less than Fulton, but more than Richmond. There would also be additional staffing and transportation expenses related to securely handling the large number of ballots. And as others have said, you are moving to a manual process of actually selecting the correct ballot. You're giving your poll workers the responsibility of correctly choosing the right ballot for the voter. And in today's system, that's an automatic thing through the encoding option on the express poll that selects the right district combo. We would hope that the next system would have some automatic function as well, whatever that looks like, but so that you're not going into a manual selection process. As Mr. Barron said, especially in the early voting locations where they have every ballot available. In our county in November, we had 252 different ballot styles. And so you'd have to have enough of all of those ballot styles for selection. Besides pushing the costs down to the counties of printing paper ballots, as this bill correctly, I think, goes in the direction, the paper ballots are not inclusive for all voters. And this bill recognizes that not everyone can see a paper ballot or even grip a pen. All voters should be able to use the same system rather than requiring disabled voters to vote differently than non-disabled voters. I'm glad to see that there will be an extended time in which we can audit a selection of ballots before certification. Even though it would be more work for us, I think it's important that those audits consist of hand counting the alpha text on those printed ballots. Again, people are worried about barcodes. I understand that that's an encoded thing, so it is a little scary. But the barcodes we use in all of our facets of life make for faster transactions. If we test ahead of time the accuracy of those encodings and do audits afterwards on the alpha text that the voters have actually reviewed, we would be able to test the accuracy of that every election. I do have a little bit of concerns on the extra certification time in the bill. I think it's sections 41 and 44. We do need extra time to do these audits before we certify, but it does impact the timing of runoff preparation. And those runoffs that are on the 28th day after an election, a 4-week runoff, that's going to be really tight. And I would wonder if there would be a consideration to make all runoffs 9 weeks after the election. I know that's not popular in some places. Regarding the cybersecurity issues that we've heard, I was at some of the Safe Commission meetings. What I understood from what I heard was that any system that has more electronic components has a higher degree of vulnerability of cybersecurity intrusion. So not that a ballot marking device particularly is vulnerable, but it is another component of electronic function. The scanners, as has been mentioned, that would tabulate the votes in either of these proposals of paper ballot system or a ballot marking device system is also an electronic component. That the election night computer to print out, to bring in all of the, the memory cards from the optical scan devices, that's another component. So yes, it is adding one more layer, but they are all somewhat vulnerable, to a cybersecurity intrusion. The main thing that we do, or that we, it's not necessarily in this bill, but it's in practice from the Secretary of State's directions and the State Election Board rules, is maintain physical security of all of the devices, making sure we have a chain of custody, that things are locked and sealed, and we have alarms and cables and those sorts of things. Moving on from that, we, as election officials, are very happy that this bill fixes many of the voter registration and absentee voting issues that we've experienced in the last few elections and that there have been court challenges on. For instance, though, it's critical that we do retain the ability to make voter records inactive when appropriate, so that resource planning can use the numbers of active voters and we aren't wasting resources for voters who are no longer there. But we do like the fact that this bill proposes extra time and a second notice before inactive voters are actually removed from the list. And those are my comments. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Janine. Let's see. Mr. Williams.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Appreciate your work very much and your dedication. You just said something that triggered a thought, to not waste supplies on inactive voters and only preparing for active voters. Is it not true if an inactive voter shows up at the poll to vote, it's automatically moved from inactive to active? So you got to be prepared. You've got to have that.
You are correct, sir. But when we do all of our election planning for how many of everything that we put out at the voting locations, how many pens and pencils and everything, we use the numbers of active voters, knowing that not all active voters will even come. But you are correct that if an inactive voter comes, they also will be able to vote.
Right.
But we don't plan for the total of registered voters. We plan on active.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
Ma'am, Mr. Chairman. May
Yes,
I?
sir, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a very appropriate time with Representative Williams' question and also our voting director from Cobb County so graciously being here. A county that size, she just kind of said to you the problems that you would have if you did not try to maintain an accurate voter list. This wisdom, so to speak, is not lost upon anybody. In fact, the reason that we have to maintain accurate voter lists, take people off who are no longer voting, no longer active after a certain period of time, is because federal law requires us to do that. I want to very briefly, Mr. Chairman, read to you part of the National Voter Registration Act. This is 52 United States Code 2507, the National Voter Registration Act, Section 8. Here's what it states. Each state shall, and here's the pertinent part, conduct a general program that makes reasonable effort to remove the names of ineligible voters from the official list of eligible voters by reason of death or resignation or change in the residence of the registrant. That is federal law. We have no choice but to try to comply with that, and the voting director just stated from a practical purpose how important it is to maintain that. It's also a requirement of federal law that we do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Trammell, did you wish to be recognized? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But the one thing that this, when we talk about inactive voters, we are not required by federal law to remove voters simply because they haven't voted. That statute speaks to ineligibility. We've made the legislative determination that we're going to purge voters who have not voted in recent elections. But that's a statutory decision that this General Assembly has made. That's not required by federal law.
Well, I think in response to that, Representative Trammell, this goes back to a decision made that we would try to maintain our voter list to 1997. It was enacted by a Democratic-controlled legislature, signed by a Democratic governor. Now, the wisdom that existed then that this would be smart to try to keep our voters list so the director from Cobb would not have the incredible challenges and the problems that she just described is probably still good wisdom today. What we've done in this bill is we have made even more efforts under Georgia law to reach out to people that are no longer there, quite frankly. The ERIC system that lets other states notify us when someone comes or goes. So the fact that people move regularly, the fact that we will give them more time to put out that window of 10 years where you have a driver's license, you seem to ignore the fact in your statement that we do have to try to comply with that federal law, and we put forth a reasonable effort to do that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might respond, we have other sections in the code presently that address when somebody files a change of address and they move, when voters are deceased, that don't rely on the inactivity. But
what code section is
to
that?
suggest that what we're doing with inactive voters somehow pertains that we're mandated to remove voters because they haven't voted simply isn't true.
What code
now, they
section
might
is that?
fall in
What
that
code
section.
section is that you're referring to?
We'll be glad. I'll get you the site on it.
Thank you.
But when somebody in the election official can speak to it, when they're notified that there's an obituary or there's a death from the department and they get a deceased, when they get a death certificate, they're required by statute. Isn't that true? You're required by statute to remove that voter from the rolls.
Yes, that's true. When we are notified of a death, we do remove a voter.
Is that it, Mr. Trammell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Let's see, number 25. Mr. Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Representative Williams said, that's triggered a thought to me as well. We're in a growing county, and is it not true that keeping refreshed voter rolls actually is doing a favor to the people that are moving into our county? So is it not true that this would help, in fact, remind people that they need when they walk in and they can't vote, they think they just moved in and they think their registration follows them. They don't realize they're voting in a different state house race district. Isn't that true?
Well, I think I understand what you're asking, and yes, in a growing county like Walton that's growing as fast as you are, you do want to keep up those voter rolls, and you send out contacts to people to try to remind them when they're not active that you have to let you know if they move somewhere. But only one small change I would make to what you said. You can always vote when you come in there, even if you have problems on election day. That's what we have the whole provisional ballot process. No one that comes in is ever not allowed to vote if they claim that they are registered and that they're supposed to be there. They can always vote that provisional ballot, and then there's a period of time for them to come back and correct whatever problem was.
We have a follow-up question.
Absolutely.
So then let's speak to that fact. Educate me. So someone moves into our county, they've not properly registered to vote. They come in and want to vote in the state house race or the state senate race. They're brand new. Are you saying by voting a provisional ballot, their vote for the statewide constitutional officers might apply, but they would not be able to register same day for the district race or the senate race?
Well, remember that same ballot that they vote on is going to have multiple offices.
Right.
So you have to go to the county that you're supposed to be in. You can't vote in the wrong county and get to vote for county commissioners within a place where you don't live and you're not registered properly. But the bottom line is there is time to get corrected any problem as to why someone thought you weren't registered there, but you were actually properly registered there, and that's the provisional ballot process.
Well, final question.
Sure.
During this effort to clean up the voter rolls, you're saying the Secretary of State's office does mail questionnaire.
The counties do.
Or the counties do, to the address on record for
Absolutely.
that voter.
Absolutely.
And if they are having the mail forwarded, and I know
They'll
that's a
get it.
limited window of time, they would get it and that would say, oh, I need to register to vote. In the meantime, you'd be renewing your driver's license and have the
that'll
opportunity
update your
to-
address automatically there as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When people become inactive voters, it triggers a mechanism and you start sending out confirmation notices. How many of those do you send out before someone's removed from your roll?
Currently, we just send out the one confirmation notice when we are notified that there is a reason to believe that they no longer are eligible to vote in our county. And if they do not respond to that, then they become inactive. I think this bill has an additional notice, which is one of the things that we liked.
Yes, it does.
That even though it has also an extended period of time for that person to stay inactive, and then before they are actually removed, they get another notice or it's sent to their registered address. In my opinion, the one single notice is not really enough.
Right. And a lot of times those notices are returned to
Correct.
you by undeliverable. Wasn't it also just a few years ago a law when you were notified someone had died that you had to send the deceased person a letter to verify that they had died?
Yes, sir. It was very tough to get the calls from the spouse or the family members when we had sent that letter. Yes.
And that's the whole purpose of the updating everything, and some changes have been made, and I thank you for your job.
Thank you.
Thank
There
you.
has been a change in one of the previous sessions that allowed us to use the obituaries for that purpose, so we didn't have to send the letter. We very much appreciated that. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I see none.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you very much for subjecting yourself to this committee today. I see that we have the resident expert from the Association of County Commissioners, Mr. Todd Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Todd Edwards with the Association County Commissioners of Georgia. First of all, we want to thank the General Assembly for both that past year, where I know there were probably 4 pieces of legislation going through this committee that dealt with the replacement of Georgia's voting machines. Didn't quite come out, no agreement. Then Secretary of State Brian Kemp established the SAFE Commission. Representative Fleming, I believe, was co-chair of it. And that commission included 4 or 5 local elections officials. I can't thank y'all highly enough for including them in the process. When ACCG deals with elections issues, or just like any other issue that we deal with the association, we rely on our county experts. Like we've seen today, we've had testimony from 3 of our largest counties, from Fulton County, Cobb County, Richmond County. And those are the same folks that guide our policy. ACCG is in full support of House Bill 316. We're in full support of ballot marking devices over hand-marked paper ballots. We're very much appreciative of the $150 million that is appropriated or proposed in the governor's FY 2020 proposed budget for the procurement of this equipment. Georgia counties look forward to continuing being partners with you in this process. I think we all understand the state, you all, the General Assembly, the governor set the policies for Georgia. We look to the Secretary of State to set guidance on election systems, but ultimately at the end of the day, counties, our staff, our taxpayers are responsible for carrying out the elections in Georgia. It's not a job we take lightly. We're very concerned. We've been involved. We want to continue to participate in this bill. But where we're at, we support the bill. We thank you for your consideration and urge your favorable support. And as far as getting into the expertise, as mentioned, again, I'm not that individual. I rely on our experts, and I'm glad, very glad, they've been so welcome and included in this process. With that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you, Todd. Do we have any questions of Mr. Edwards? Mr. Trammell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate your testimony.
Yes,
and
sir.
understand you're in support of the bill and in support of the ballot marking devices. And what I want to ask you is there are a bunch of provisions in this bill that don't relate to the voting machines. And I want to ask if it's ACCG's position that they're in support of all the sections in the bill, or is there a provision that you're
Well,
not taking a position on?
I'll tell you, we have not, we're in support of the bill. Now, as we do with any piece of legislation, as soon as we get it, we go over it with our attorneys, then send it out to the counties to get their feedback. In this case, I've had nothing but positive feedback. I think the two comments, one from Cobb, were shared today on the after the election, running into the audit, running into, I mean, we get those type of concerns, but I have not had any negative feedback. I know there's a lot additional responsibilities on counties. I think as a state, we assume our responsibilities and implementing them as counties, we take that seriously. I know there's been a lot of bills over the past several years to restore some integrity, or more integrity, surety, address some issues in the process. We're willing to do our part and work a little harder to make that happen at the county level. But I have not heard anything negative from our members regarding the House Bill 316.
Finished, Mr. Trammell? Thank you. Do we have any other
Thank you.
questions of Mr. Edwards from any of the subcommittee members? Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Mr.
Always a
Chairman.
pleasure to have
Yes,
you.
sir.
All right. Everybody hold their breath for just a second. We have several people that wish to be heard this afternoon. And I will go ahead and tell you that we have scheduled at least 2, if not 3 hours for tomorrow afternoon, because I want to be sure that everyone has an opportunity to be heard to make their comments. At this time, I'm going to start, we're going to start on the list. We've probably got another good 30, 40 minutes left, and we might be able to knock off a lot of the folks that might want to be heard today. And so that being said, let's just start with the first list. Liz Troop. Ms. Troop?
Thank you. If I may, I made visual aids so that the legislators can have a visual understanding of what's going on with these two systems of election equipment. With your permission, I'll distribute those. Is that all right?
Well, do we have any of the subcommittees have any problems understanding the two different systems that we're looking at?
The reason that I made a visual flow chart is to show the similarities and differences between hand-marked paper ballots and ballot marking devices, because I think that there's really a lot of similarities in terms of the procedures and the controls, especially in terms of how paper is handled. Hand-marked paper ballots and ballot marking devices both involve knowing, especially if it's mixed precinct voting or primary voting, knowing which ballot style is important. So in both cases, a voter would go to they would check in and they would be given a ballot, and it would either be printed for a hand-marked paper ballot, or it would be something that would be inserted into this ballot marking device, and it has to indicate the ballot style on it. It has to have a barcode or something that says Precinct 17 or Democratic Party or whatever that is. So there are a lot of similarities in terms of printing prices, printing transportation and storage that I think have been a bit confused in this conversation this afternoon. They both involve printing and chain of custody for that printing. The second image for the hand-marked paper ballot is someone takes a pen, not a pencil, and they mark their choices. They can look at them and review them. With the other system, there's an electronic device. The piece of paper is inserted into that. It has to be fed in. People make their choices on the screen. And then when they're all finished and they've seen the choices that they made, then that piece of paper comes back out with a summary. And they have to remember if that summary matches the choices they made on the screen. They don't see the candidates. They don't see the party of the candidate. They don't see who they voted against. They just see the summary. And they can check that, but the problem is that that is not meaningful because there's also a barcode on it. We don't know why that barcode is there. As has been discussed in this afternoon, there are a lot of vendors who will make this equipment. They can make whatever we want. They don't need to make it with that barcode, but for some reason, all the proposals we've seen with the ballot marking devices, it seems there's these barcodes. I also want to interject that we could make both the accessible version of the ballot and the hand-marked paper ballot look identical. We're Georgia, we're huge. These vendors could make those ballots look identical. There's no reason that they can't be the same size and configuration. In any case, with a hand-marked paper ballot, the voter walks over to a scanner tabulator that's right in the precinct. They put it in. If there's overvotes, undervotes, if it's mismarked, they're immediately alerted and can submit a fresh ballot if they want. Then it's immediately tabulated and goes into a lockbox. It's not that different for the ballot marking device. That they get a piece of paper, it's printed out with a thermal printer, that thing that indicated their precinct, pre-printed, then gets printed a second time with the thermal printing with a summary, and they take that, they can look at it if they want. It's not very meaningful, but they can look at it if they want, and they put it into the scanner tabulator. So they both immediately scan and tabulate. I know a lot of people remember stories about ballot stuffing, and there's a lot of talk about big boxes full of paper floating around, but they both involve paper, and they both tabulate it immediately and put it into a lockbox. At the end of the day, the poll supervisor can immediately look at the results of that tabulation, whether it's the ballot marking device or the hand-marked paper ballot. There's no slowdown, as has been suggested, between these two systems. They're very similar in terms of getting results at the end of the day. Another important difference is with audits. With hand-marked paper ballots, they've been scanned and tabulated. If somebody overvoted or undervoted, they were alerted to that. But you can go back and you can kind of guess what voter intent is, and that's what auditing is. A meaningful audit has to do with trying to capture the intent of the voter. You can also audit the pieces of paper with the ballot marking devices, but all you see with your eyes, the auditor sees, is a summary. They don't know whether it matches the barcode, and they don't know if somebody tapped the wrong spot on the machine, which, let's face it, I mean, like, did you ever tap the wrong thing on your cell phone or use the cursor and print out the wrong document on your computer? Right, those things happen. You can't get that out of audit. So thank you for listening to me. I think hopefully these images are helpful.
Thank you so much. All right. Very good. Let's see, Elizabeth Shackelford.
Good afternoon. It's been a long one. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to remind many of the people in this room were in this room roughly about a year ago. And on those screens, we heard from a cybersecurity expert, Jeremy Epstein. He's not only a cybersecurity expert, he's part of the National Science Foundation and is consulted with regularly. And he told us that bar none, hand-marked paper ballots are the state of the art when it comes to secure voting systems. We've heard a lot of information about a lot of different factors, and we have to weigh various factors with respect to coming up with a new voting system. We've also heard a number of myths about hand-marked paper ballots bandied about, including things like talking about pencils, when most hand-marked paper ballot systems use pens. And when people have talked about how the voter immediately inserts her ballot into the scanner. There is no opportunity for hanging chads or any of that other stuff. The scanners are equipped to detect stray marks, inappropriate marks, or overvotes, and will immediately send the ballot back to the voter to correct or void. So there's none of that kind of nonsense that happened in the past with the butterfly ballots and the pins getting transported downtown, all of that. We've also heard that with ballot marking devices, electronic ballot marking devices, that they are, quote, not connected to the internet. And this is one of the biggest myths about these systems. That individual machine, when it's used to vote on, is not connected to the internet. That's true. But the information that that machine needs to be able to display ballot information and process that ballot came from another computer somewhere, a server sitting on a network, which is connected to the internet. Now, for us, this is kind of wild, out there fallacy stuff. It's kind of hard to imagine, but the bad guys, they've got that all figured out. In fact, several of the ballot marking device machines that were demoed at one of the very many vendor demos that have happened were hacked during the demo. I think the security of our vote is extraordinarily paramount among all these considerations. But people have been making a case that hand-marked paper ballots are actually more expensive than a ballot marking device system, which is a myth. A ballot marking device system would cost straight up the first year roughly $150 million. Hand-marked paper, $120 million that could help Georgia's schools, that could help those in downstate Georgia with rural health care. There are many, many purposes that would be way more important than spending money enriching these vendors who really, really are working very hard to get Georgia to spend $150 million. With respect to, I'm really kind of stunned that, first of all, that the SAFE Commission of 18 people had one, counting one, cybersecurity expert on it. We have, just in Atlanta, there are 2 nationally recognized cybersecurity experts, Logan Lamb and Rich DeMillo, who could easily have been appointed to the commission and or referred to. I'm stunned that apparently, and I'm just a lowly little citizen, what do I know? But apparently the commission did not see fit to talk to any of the many, many states that have implemented hand-marked paper ballot systems very successfully, where they and their citizens are perfectly happy. Various people have brought up various kinds of issues, researching and talking to a few states that use strictly hand-marked paper ballot systems probably could allay many of those items. But ultimately, to me, it comes down to why, when you could have a system that is recognized by the cybersecurity experts as the most secure, why would you not go for it? Why, when you could have a system which is transparent, where the voter can see exactly who she voted for, not have to depend on a barcode, which could well have been hacked, why would you not go for the ultimate in transparency? Why? There was, at the SAFE Commission meetings that I attended, there was overwhelming support among many, many members of the public who spoke for hand-marked paper ballots. Why would you not listen to the public in those kind of numbers? Our midterm elections were the laughingstock of this nation for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons was many, as covered by many, many national publications, are horrific DRE machines. Why, when we have been so ill-served by those machines and by their main vendor, ES&S, who has way too much influence in this process, why would we go and get DRE 2.0 when we can get a cheaper, more transparent, and more importantly, more secure voting system? Thank you so much.
If you might, could you tell me your organization, Indivisible GRPS, what is that group?
Indivisible groups, there's a nationwide organization called Indivisible, and there are many chapters throughout the country, many chapters in the Atlanta area, and I represent 2 of those chapters.
Thank you, ma'am. Do you,
Answer a question? I mean,
go right ahead.
would you be willing to answer a question, Ms. Shackelford?
As best I can.
Would you please, for the microphone so other folks. I'm gonna refer to the handy visual aid we were presented with. Are you familiar with that?
Nope, haven't
Okay.
seen that.
Basically, from this part of the process on, it's pretty much identical. Would that be a fair? That's somebody back there is giving me a thumbs up, so I'm going to take that as true. Okay, so basically from this part forward to the process, we're looking at an identical process. There's a ballot. It's been marked at this point. It goes through a scanner, goes to an audit process, and then we have a result. Would that be a fair?
It goes through the scanner, it is tabulated at that point, and as someone mentioned earlier, it drops into a lockbox.
Correct.
Right then and there.
So would you agree with me when I say that the locked box scanner tabulator is an electronic piece of equipment and is also vulnerable, therefore, because it is electronic?
Right,
It potentially could be hacked.
right.
So if even with a hand-marked paper ballot system, because we're relying on electronic ballot tabulator, that it's possible that even with hand-marked paper ballots, because we're relying on technology,
Right.
that it could be hacked.
Right, and the thing is that as you mentioned, the ballot marking device system uses that same thing.
Right.
Apparently, at the state of the current technology, that's the best solution for the actual scanning. And both systems are using that same like you said, that portion of the process.
Yeah, I mean, as I look at this particular piece of paper, I can fold it in half, and I see that the process is identical, and therefore we would have the same problems with hand-marked paper ballots as we would with electronic ballot marking devices.
No,
Because,
I don't.
no,
I disagree.
Well, you just told me that ballot marking tabulators could potentially be hacked. Is that not true?
What, to be very clear,
Uh-huh.
the portion of the process that starts with the scanner, you're absolutely right, that if somebody, because it's an electronic system, somebody could hack either that scanning system based on a ballot marking device system or a hand-marked paper device. However, on the left side, hand-marked paper minimizes the hacking opportunities.
But there would still be potential for if somebody wanted to. I mean, when I look at my coffee mug and I think about how much human engineering's gone into brewing a cup of coffee, what we're talking about is who's going to be in charge and counting the votes and making sure the score is reported. I mean, just think about taking a fraction of them, how much human energy has been put into a cup of coffee, and then apply that to, somebody's going to try to hack a tabulator at some point.
Absolutely.
Even if it's a hand-marked paper ballot.
Right.
So that's where I'm going with this. Well, I'm sorry for the outburst, Mr. Chairman, but that's exactly where I'm going with this. It doesn't, and this is what I've been trying with every question I've asked today has been driving to this point. And that is, it doesn't matter which one you have. There are going to be cybersecurity problems because you're relying on machines to count the votes, and you must have a risk limiting audit that you can have confidence in the results.
Yes.
When every voter walks away, they know that they can believe that the result was accurate. And so isn't it true, the absolute most important part of whatever it is we do, because there's problems in both, is the risk limiting audit piece?
I personally don't know how to answer that, but what I can say is that left-hand side where ballot marking device machines got hacked even in a demo says to me that that's an extraordinarily insecure way of actually designating my vote. Whereas if I'm marking a piece of paper, there's nobody hacking that piece of paper while I'm sitting there just making my marks and then feeding it into the scanner. Yes, you're right, scanners have vulnerabilities, but in a sense they're awash because both major types of systems use them. And yes, somebody will, and probably has, hacked one. It will happen. But I want to minimize the total security risk, and I want to kind of pay attention to what the cybersecurity experts, these are computer science pros, and for somebody who's a computer science geek nerd to admit that a non-computerized process is better and state-of-the-art, that takes a lot. And I feel like those people are in the best position to evaluate the vulnerabilities when you use a touchscreen system that can easily be hacked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all. All right. I've just sat here and did a little calculation about the number of folks that's already signed up to speak. If we go for 8 to 10 minutes, as has been the custom of the first two people, then we're going to probably be looking at about 6 hours. And so that being said, I'm going to start randomly calling out people that wish to speak. And, you know, I'm going to start randomly calling out people who have signed up out of an abundance of precaution, because I don't know which sheet was which. But if I might ask them if they might, for the benefit of others who may wish to speak, if you could be hasty with what you're saying, make your point, and we can move on, because we've set aside probably 2 to 3 hours tomorrow. All right. Next up, Melanie Manning. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name's Melanie Manning, and I'm a Georgia voter and a poll watcher. I echo the sentiments of my eloquent neighbor, and I'll do my best to not repeat what she just said. I'm also here to urge you to maintain the ratio of 1 to 200 voters per voting machine, and I also ask you to expand that same requirement to the express poll computers. One of the major issues that we have in Georgia is long wait lines. It impacts our turnout. The bill should seek to improve this. As a poll watcher, I've witnessed many reasons for this, including unequal distribution of resources among precincts and polling sites. I witnessed this inequity at 2 polling sites this past November. These 2 sites were Dunwoody Library in DeKalb and Pinckneyville Y in Gwinnett County. Dunwoody Library serves nearly 2,600 registered voters, according to the Secretary of State. On Election Day, this polling site had 7 express poll computers and 15 DRE machines and consistently reasonable wait times. And as we spoke about that ratio earlier in the hearing, that translates to 173 voters per DRE machine in Dunwoody. The Gwinnett site serves nearly 3,300 registered voters, 28% more than the Dunwoody Library. Despite having 700 more registered voters than Dunwoody Library, this site was resourced with only 2 express poll machines, and one of them consistently froze up and had to be rebooted. They also had only 7 DRE voting machines. This precinct started the day with a 1-hour wait time, and I watched it grow to more than 2 hours by late afternoon. Voters I spoke to told me that it's always this way at that site. I also witnessed many cars pull into the parking lot and leave after seeing the long line out the door. Taking it back to that ratio that I mentioned, that translates to 471 voters per DRE machine at the Gwinnett site. This resource inequity shows in the turnout rates. Well-resourced Dunwoody Library reported a 74% turnout in 2018, while Gwinnett's Pinckneyville reported a turnout of only 42%. In closing, I urge you to maintain the ratio of 1 to 200 voters per voting machine. As was demonstrated at Dunwoody Library, that was sufficient. I also urge you to enforce the existing ratio at precincts that may not be following it. And I ask you to also expand that requirement to apply to the express poll computers so that we don't have a bottleneck at check-in, like many of us have even mentioned here today, and I witnessed myself as a poll watcher. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Oh, Stacy Hopkins.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to speak in front of the committee. I stand here and I'm going to try not to be frustrated because it seems, and I don't want to be redundant, but I think you need to hear the redundancies because it seems apparent to us, we the people, that we keep saying our demands to our elected officials and you guys aren't listening. We're sitting up here listening to you taking advice from one expert when there are multiple experts around the country who say that hand-marked paper ballots are the more sufficient way to go. And for me, I have a particular concern. We just saw reports that our current DRE machines are mysteriously erasing black voters in black precincts. I don't want any cousin, uncle, relative, or anything of what machines we have right now to be implemented and to use $150 million of our money. It's not your money, it's our money. And we're telling you what we want. And you're telling us, no, we're going to give you this. Now, I've listened, and to be honest, I love the package of the bill, except for the machines. Okay? Everything sounds great, and it's supposed to be, oh yeah, we should vote for this. But it does not matter, and for me to sit here, and I'm glad you're here, Secretary of State Raffensperger, because there's a question that your predecessor could not answer, but I'm going to ask you about the purges. What list was I on? I've been an active voter in Georgia since 1992. I moved in the same county, yet myself and 380,000 people received those notices. Out of those 380,000, 159,000 were in the same circumstances that I were in. Now, Mr. Barron, I asked that question of Mr. Rick Barron, who was here. He has left the room. What list were we on? And I do agree we should use Eric. That was something that I suggested from the beginning, and I'm very glad to hear that recommendation. It is accurate, but I have another question. What list were you using? Because we were told we weren't using cross-check. Then we were told we stopped using cross-check. Now I don't know what list we were using, but for me, what list was I on? I'm being told that our machines aren't connected to the internet. I worked in Fulton County collecting the vote. And when I asked, why were there 3 voting machines in the teacher's lunchroom while we were collecting the vote? Why were there some bags that did not have memory cards? People looked at me like I was crazy. And naturally, I'm not working that anymore, and I'm kind of glad, but I've seen all I need to see. So there's a lot of things that are being said here today that really do not make any type of sense. And what really does not make sense is that we are going to spend $150 million when we can do it much less, much cheaper, and much more accurately. None of this makes any sense to me. And I really would like some of you to explain it to me, how it makes sense to you that this is a good bill. I don't have anything to say because, I mean, I've just had a hell of a day. I had to testify in front of a subcommittee, and do you understand how it feels to be black in this state? Do you understand what it feels like to be a person of color in this state? You have to constantly verify, identify, re-verify, jump over barriers, go under hoops, and then you get a notice in the mail telling you we're going to move you to an inactive status when I had just voted in the last election in the same year that the notice was sent to me. So I don't know what to say. I'm tired of screaming, I'm tired of yelling, I'm tired of showing my behind, but I love this state. I love this country. My husband's a veteran. My daughter's a veteran. I have a member of every generation of my family that has fought for this country. And you know what really offends me? To hear this body say, when my family has put their lives on the line, how much does that cost? But yet we can sit here and squabble about the cost of elections. I'm sorry, I can't comprehend any of this. I really can't. So I hope that you listen to some of the words, and I'm not going to repeat the redundancies. I'm going to allow these people to have their say. I've said quite enough. But I need someone, I don't really need y'all to ask questions. I don't need to ask you questions. I need y'all to answer ours. So, you know, I thank you for the opportunity for me to sit here, and I love that there was bipartisanship in bringing this bill together. However, the bipartisanship looks like we're going to put a whole lot of good in to make you swallow this bad pill. That's not bipartisanship, that's acquiescence, and that's not how we should be governing this state. This is not how we should be governing in this country. And can we please, for the sake of all of us, make this truly a state that we can all be proud of? Because right now I'm not proud of Georgia at all. So I thank you for your time. I'm going to take me an Advil, go home, and go to bed.
Ma'am, could I ask you to...
Excuse me just a second. Before you take that Advil, we have a committee member.
Thank you for your passion. I think you and I would get along really well.
Come to the house, we'll hang out.
I'm going to take you up on that. How would it make you feel if I presented you with evidence, statistical evidence, that shows that hand-marked paper ballots disenfranchise down-ballot votes for African Americans?
What if I showed you that we have voting machines that was mysteriously taking away black voters from precincts?
Well, I'm not. I would probably be interested in having that conversation with you, but I would ask that you would answer. You know, are you aware of any studies or statistics that show that hand-marked paper ballots specifically disenfranchise African American voters?
No, but I have more faith in a paper ballot. And let me tell you, that's one of the things that I wrote down. All of this would be easy to accept, right? But there's one factor missing: trust. We no longer have trust in the majority of you. We really don't. We're asked to vote for you. Sometimes it's a Sophie's choice kind of thing. We don't really have a choice, right? I mean, I have a question about why why other people in other parts of the state can vote for my public service commission, even though me and my county may have voted for somebody. Savannah and all these other areas get to vote on. We don't trust any. I want to believe what you say is true. I can't. And especially after I've seen what the state of Georgia has done to me, some in my community, and we still can't get any answers. So I would love to see your data, and I'd like to show you mine.
Sounds
so
fair.
We can play that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the conversation. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Priscilla Smith.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm Priscilla Smith. I'm in House District 89. I'm in Elena Parent's Senate District. Appreciate the opportunity. I won't repeat what I've heard. There are a couple of suggestions and things that I would like to clarify. My experience with the demonstrations was that with hand-marked paper ballots, there is no code necessary, period. Even for the optical scanners, you don't have to have any UPC, you don't have to have a barcode, you don't have to have a QR code. You can do a hand-marked paper ballot, and it will be read by the scanner without any kind of extra coding on it, so you know exactly what's going into the scanner. The other thing is that regarding ADA, and as a person who is an artist and who has run organizations where accessibility is a real issue, is one of the very first things I consider when I'm looking at putting on an event is it ADA? Because I don't want to make things different for people in wheelchairs if I don't have to. I want to make it as accessible as possible. Outside of this building, outside the building across the street, you got a ramp and you got stairs. Why not have ballot marking devices in much more limited numbers? And you can choose to use. You can have one or two at any given precinct. You can choose to use a ballot marking device, or you can do a hand marked. It will lessen the danger of any kind of cyber intrusion into what's going on in the voting, and it will obscure who's voting by ballot marking device so that you don't have the danger of people that are need assisted devices having some sort of a different looking ballot. As far as the rest of it's concerned, I've wondered from the very beginning, why are we so anxious to spend $150 million that we don't need to be spending when we can spend for 30? Why are we so anxious to have ES&S, the grandchild of Diebold, who has been so much trouble for decades in this country? Why are we so happy to spend $150 million with Diebold, which is what ES&S has become? I have friends in Birmingham, Alabama, who vote hand-marked paper ballots. They had absolutely no difficulty. You mark your ballot yourself. You take it yourself to the scanner. It drops into a secure box. There's no danger of anybody grabbing my ballot and putting a stray mark on it or doing anything like that. It stays in my hands the whole time until I put it into the scanner. I have friends in Maryland who are poll workers. The number of steps required for setting up for paper ballots was reduced by more than a dozen for doing hand-marked paper ballots over having to do ballot marking devices. So those are some actual real little pieces of real facts about how people actually have interacted in hand-marked paper ballot kinds of situations, not to mention that it saves over $100 million. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
I had a question for you, ma'am. Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, you still, if this were to go in effect, and if the state did buy ballot marking devices, you could still request a provisional ballot and vote that ballot without using the ballot marking device, could you not? So that could alleviate part of what you just said. That will be there, that you don't have to use the ballot marking device. If you don't trust it, you don't want to use it, ask for the provisional ballot. That's what it's for.
Well, yeah, maybe. But what would be the point of doing that when you could solve the problem from the get-go by not buying ballot marking devices, except for to the tune of, $2,700 as opposed to $27,000?
But I'm just repeating what you said. I'm just answering your question. When you said if you don't want to use it, you don't have to. Why can't you use a paper ballot and mark it? You can. You can ask for the
I don't have an
ballot.
answer to the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I'm suggesting is you can reduce the expense radically, compromise on having ballots that are marked by hand, people that need assistive devices, right? So if I have a physical disability and I'm not able to use a pen to mark my ballot, then I can use a ballot marking device. But I may be perfectly able-bodied and able to use a pen to mark my ballot. But suppose it's available to me to use a ballot marking device, then I can do that. It will obscure my point is, that's a way of obscuring. We worry about people with disabilities having their ballots look different, right? Okay, so when I go in to vote, if I choose to walk up the ramp instead of take the stairs, right, it puts me in the same category as a person in a wheelchair. If I choose to use a ballot marking device instead of doing a hand-marked paper ballot, then it puts me in the same category as somebody who needs assistance in marking their ballot. Do you understand? Okay, thank you very much.
Cindy. Battle?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I am Cindy Battles, and I am the Election Protection Coordinator for Common Cause Georgia. You guys have a problem. People don't trust you, and you've already heard that. As a member of the EP Coalition and someone who spoke to, not exaggerating, hundreds of voters after the midterms, voters no longer trust the process in Georgia. And honestly, you're not doing anything to fix it today. This bill was introduced on Thursday. It was made available to the public on Friday. And after a holiday weekend, it's in subcommittee on Tuesday. I commend Representative Fleming for the amount of things that he was able to put in this bill, but we still have organizations who are analyzing the bill. That's how fast this process is moving. We not only need to come up with a comprehensive bill that fixes Georgia's elections, but we need to do it in a way that re-earns the trust of Georgia voters. I don't think you're doing it today. I think that we need more time. We need more time to analyze the bill. We need more time to study it. You see a lot of people here. That's because people like me and a lot of these other activist organizations worked through the weekend to make sure everyone knew that this hearing was happening. We need a transparent process for this bill and for this for the not just the voting machines. We're focusing so much on the voting machines because there's so many other things in the bill, but there needs to be a transparent process and there needs to be accountability. And it doesn't feel like there's either one of those things. To restore trust, things like Representative Fleming said that he mentioned the audits and how great that the audits would be to restore confidence. But if the paper ballot isn't the official ballot on record, those audits are useless. We need to be discussing this further, and that's what I'm going to ask this committee the subcommittee to do, is to do their part in helping to restore voter confidence by slowing our roll just a little bit so that we can do this properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Battles. Believe it or not, there are no questions. George Balbona.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to ask why, I've been doing this for almost 3 years now. Everybody who goes to these on any side sees me here. I record everything. That's what I do. I'd like to thank Ed Reisner for getting security and saying I can't record as I've always done for the 3 years today. Why? Now all of a sudden I have to be credentialed media? I'm media. That means many. I'm one of the many. I'm here, I'm covering, and I'm documenting. I'm a witness. Let's start talking. All right. Barry, thanks for being here. You seem to be everywhere. Vice Chairman of HB 316, co-chair of the so-called SAFE Commission, running the show at the SB 403 House Governmental Affairs Committee right here in this room, less than a year ago, March 13th. Congressman, please listen to what your buddy Barry Fleming had to say less than a year ago in this very room when discussing the possibility of Georgia counties having to pick up any additional costs related to new voting machines. And I quote, "Nothing happens that we ask them to do unless we tell them to do it or we appropriate the money, and we can do either." So just because we put something here now, that won't change the fact that we can always change it later. And I've met no one around this capital that doesn't think we're going to buy new voting machines. Is he looking at this room? I don't think so, okay? In fact, it's referenced strictly in the bill, so we'll take up the amendments, Chairman Setzler, Ed Setzler, as you want, but I'm not sure that we have to do that. He doesn't care. All I ask is for people to be educated. The only reason to pass this bill is either ignorance, either because you've been misled or you care not to know, or corruption, it's real, or both, okay? Now, the SAFE Commission, a lot of people don't know that SAFE, and that word there, is an acronym. Let's look at it. Secure. No, it ignores all cyber experts, even the National Enquirer when it has something priceless, puts it on paper and locks it in a safe. So do all Fortune 500 companies, okay? Secure, that's the first one. Accessible, yes, extremely accessible to bad actors and hackers, okay? Fair, certainly not. Elections, no. And this is where it gets really scary. HB 13 provides us with unconstitutional appointments, masquerading as the will of the people and fair elections, okay? There's not a person here today who can read a barcode. Why do we have to put that extra level, that superfluous level, step into our votes? Okay? You think, oh, barcode, I go to the store, it tells me how much something costs. No, it's never told you anything. It tells a machine what it costs. And it could tell you to change that D to an R like that. And you cannot do any kind of, you can't validate. It's not verifiable. You hear us talking about what the difference is between the first and the second half of that handout you got. You have a paper trail that the actual process of doing the vote is your verification. You go through, and as you do it, you're marking, and you're verifying it right there in front of your eyes. You scan it optically, just like you guys do with the other ones, and you put it in a lockbox. How is that different? It's fundamentally different because you are introducing something where shenanigans are possible and undetectable. Okay? Holly Springs, you look like you're glazing over. Why don't you tell me what you handed to Brad, our new SOS, at the vendor depot after saying Merry Christmas? He grabbed it, put it in his pocket. I have video of it. What was it? Oh, your little thing? I don't want it. Do I, Holly Springs? What's it say? Does it say something about fair and accurate and verifiable votes? Let me see it. Be bold. I do agree with that. But you guys are boldly cramming this bill down our throat at a fast rate, and I don't like it. I hate the taste. And you very much have a very, very, your average is incredible. Statistically impossible that you always land on the wrong side of history. How is that possible? Just take the time, listen to the experts, and do the damn right things. You're not doing it. Oh, and by the way, if you'd like the video, I've got a link to Barry saying exact words like that. Oh, the other thing that I'd just like to mention quickly, Ed Setzler, he was in charge of SB 403. He said we would have numbers, a good working number, by early February. That's gone, okay? It may be plus or minus millions of dollars in a $60 million program. That's gone. But we're going to have good, solid working numbers by February to do this. Yeah. This is less than a year ago. You guys are jacking up the price. You say it's 150. You know that's a lie. That's just for the hardware. That is not going to cover training, and it's not going to cover ES&S's fat maintenance and upkeep contracts, which get it more into the neighborhood of $400 to $500 from what I hear. Do the right thing.
Sir, would you be willing to take a question?
I'm not answer anything. I've been doing this for 3 years. I know more than you guys do. I'll guarantee it. Go.
I appreciate the decorum, sir. Representative Turner?
Thank you. For the record, my name is Scott Turner. It's not Holly Springs. Although
Scott with one T.
This Holly Springs is the safest city in Georgia. I'm glad that I'm very
Not
proud
for
of it.
voting.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry?
Not for voting. There's no safe harbor in our state for voting.
Sir, I'm going to listen to you as much as you'd like, but
You would not like to listen to me as much as I'd like. But go ahead.
No, I don't think you would find that we are very far apart on a lot of issues.
Excuse me.
Okay.
I want to take Chairman's privilege.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, if you don't mind, I'd like to just go ahead and just have a cordial dialogue. Would that be
Cordial.
fine?
Thank you for your time.
I sure would appreciate that, sir. Thank you so much. I'd like to give it back to Representative Turner, please.
Thank you. And just so everybody knows it's here, I made it a mission this year to I have 2 life verses. And this, I'm going to take a moment to just as a privilege because you called me out for giving a bracelet to the Secretary of State. And on that bracelet it has 2 verses, and the first one's Matthew 6:26, which says, "Don't worry about your life. Look at the birds of the air. God takes care of the birds. He's going to take care of you." And the second one is Acts 4:29, which says, "Now, Lord, consider their threats and allow your servant to speak your word with great boldness." And I have found that those 2 in combination have served me well here. And so I wanted to share that with everybody I possibly could because this is my last term. So I'm sorry that caused you to break out some sort of conspiracy theory that you thought was off the chain, but now you have that bracelet. It's the same one I gave to the secretary at the
wearing
thing, and I hope you do wear it, and I hope it brings you inspiration. And I don't mind that you're boldly speaking out today, but I have to say, there's nothing wrong with being passionate and being a witness. And I don't know what happened to you when you walked in the door today, but and I've heard the stories today about people questioning trust. I want to just, if I could, I was talking to my freshman friend here today, and I said, 2 years ago I packed this snowball at the top of a hill, and this is the result of that snowball that rolled down the hill. This is a process. We're going to hear everybody out, including you. And I'll just tell you that if you are coming at me angry, my natural inclination is to say, no, I'm not going to listen to you. But I think you're making great points in there somewhere, but they have to be pulled out. So be a witness. Be the recorder guy. If you, I'm sorry that it had to be today that you had to ask me about what I gave to the secretary that day. My cell phone number is published everywhere, and the people on this committee make themselves available to anybody that wants to talk.
I've sent emails to every individual member of
well, you know what?
My cell phone
number is published, and you didn't call me because I would have called you back, or I would have answered on the first ring. Okay. So let's just be courteous to each other. And
I will
there's
be courteous.
Look, here's the bottom line. Okay, there are going to be things in here that are going to be extraordinarily important to reestablishing trust. And I promise you, there are people on this committee that are fighting for that. And whether they have a D or an R next to their name, they're going to fight for that. And that's the only thing I have to say. I just wanted to respond to that since you said I was glazed over. I was actually hanging on every word you're saying.
Okay.
But you were so confrontational.
It's called passionate. I've been doing this for a while.
Well, you
And
know, I
let
understand
me,
that.
Let me tell you the difference between today, and I greatly appreciate the difference, is the chairman is letting us speak for as long as we'd like. Usually we have 2 minutes, and it's like you're screaming into the void. It's just this fascist, like you guys are looking at your cell phones. It's not a dialogue. That's what we need. We need a dialogue.
Well,
and we're having it now.
let's
But
do
this,
it.
again, exception, not the rule. If you guys want to make it, let's get all these people who signed up. Let's get a room and let's hash it out. Let's talk, because this is just us speaking our minds, and you guys taking it, and we don't know what you think of it.
Bring it.
Okay?
Do it. Let's do it.
All right. Here's the difference. I was a professor. I taught the physics of sound. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, like this, does it make a sound?
It does.
It does not.
It does. Because
Does
it still
not.
vibrates, and sound is vibration, and it still does.
Because
why are
you
we
need
arguing about
3 things. I was actually taught the course. Okay? You need 3 things. Yes, you need the vibration. That's our vote. Okay? That's our voice. You need a medium. That's these voting machines. Okay? And then you need an observer. Without that, it's noise. It's not sound. Okay? Right now, we can't hear ourselves, just like this. You can't hear ourselves. We can't validate and verify that our votes are what we said they were, what we want. So you have no idea what our voter intent is nullified by those barcodes and by those QR codes. Okay? That's all we're saying. And that's a big difference. And that's a huge difference. This isn't a bipartisan issue. This is the sanctity of our vote, of democracy itself. And if you guys can take that lightly, then I don't know how you sleep at night. Anyone else? And thank you again for letting us talk. Because usually we're like, oh my God, 2 minutes, and you just sound like an idiot.
Well,
I can do that at any rate.
I'm almost sorry that I had to excuse myself, but
Hey,
I'm
nature
grateful
calls.
that
It's
we
all
had
right.
a lady over here that was concerned that I was sneaking out, but I could actually
Yeah.
sneak into the men's room. Have you?
Bob, you have a question? Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. That's
done?
it. Thanks, guys.
All right, we're almost at 3 hours. I have one other person that's asked to speak that she wouldn't be able to be in attendance, Ms. McNamara, with the League, and I believe the League of Women Voters.
Oh, and I have something to respond to Mr. Scott Turner's request over the limiting audits.
We're fixing to suspend this meeting till tomorrow, and we'll pick back up tomorrow.
But it's very specific as to what
And
he
if you'll be
has.
glad, when we suspend, I'll be glad for you to give Mr. Turner your response.
Well, I think it's important, it's very important that everybody hears it today because it has exactly to do with the question he made. And I have the answer as to the question that he made regarding the paper ballots and the audits. It's very specific. If I could, it would have been faster just to say, without a microphone, no problem. Berkeley professor who invented.
Ma'am, listen, would you mind sitting down and you can be heard tomorrow, or, thank you. Yes, Ms. McNamara.
Thank you. I am Elizabeth McNamara, and I am with the League of Women Voters. This has been an extremely, this is a very controversial, there's a lot of controversial portions of this bill. I would, however, like to commend the Secretary of State's office and also the SAFE Commission for taking into account all of the issues, the legitimate issues that came up in the 2018 election, and making an attempt to address those issues in this particular piece of legislation. I think that is extremely important. The League believes in a secure, accurate, recountable, accessible, and transparent process, including with the voting system that we adopt here in Georgia. We did support the move to the DREs 16 or 17 years ago, and we absolutely support moving to a system that does have a voter-verified paper trail. With that being said, we attended all of the SAFE Commission meetings, and we were really very pleased with the results and the recommendations that the SAFE Commission made. I think one thing that, as I said, this has been a very controversial issue, and in dealing with my members who are all volunteers, one of the key recommendations from the commission that gave them a great deal of reassurance that this process, that we would have a recountable and accurate process, was the recommendation that the human readable portion of any paper ballot that is part of this process would become explicitly the official record of the election, and that there would be provisions to provide for the custody and control of those ballots for audit purposes. We are pleased to see that some provision for I'm sorry, it's very late, I've been here since 8 o'clock this morning, for a risk limiting audit, but we do believe that it would be better if the legislation were to, with all due respect for the transition issues that we're going to have before 2020, that be made express. Being able to tell my folks that human readable portion of the ballot would be the official record changed a lot of minds and also provided an awful lot of security from their point of view. So that is a specific recommendation that the League would like to make in terms of, as this legislation moves forward, if we could make that part of the legislation, I think it would go a long way to reassuring and restoring that confidence that everyone is very legitimately talking about in this hearing. So I thank you for the opportunity to get that on the table. We'll be happy to follow up in writing. We'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee or the subcommittee might have.
Thank you, Ms. McNamara. Any questions from any of the committee members? Indeed, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Now, that being said, folks, we're 3 hours into this meeting. I would like to make some observations.
Please, just less than 1 minute.
God help me, if you can do it less than 1 minute, I will waive that. Come on up.
Philip Stark is the Berkeley professor who invented risk-limited audits. He wrote a letter to Georgia lawmakers on 2/18/2019 about his concerns with the HB 316 election bill, which proposes using electronic ballot marking devices. Dr. Stark explains that BMDs are a security risk and that they don't permit meaningful post-election audits, which is required for U.S. elections. He concludes, for this reason, widespread use of BMDs undermines election integrity, and I recommend hand-marked paper ballots for voters who have the dexterity and vision to use them. Letter from 24 of the nation's foremost cyber and election security experts to Georgia SOS and Safe Committee, 1/22/2019. Electronic ballot marking devices, BMDs, pose serious security risks and don't allow for meaningful audits. Hand-marked paper ballots are recommended for fair and security voting. That was all. Thank you very much. We are going to start a campaign to send you all a copy of the letter from Philip Stark so you have this factual information. We want experts from outside of the states who are already using hand-marked paper ballots. 70% of the country. 2 hours from where I am standing now, it's Anniston, Alabama. I was there to observe elections, the fluidity, the doability, the wonderful marvels of hand-marked paper ballots. Thank you.
Well, you almost made it in 1 minute. So, and if you could, what is your name so we can go ahead and strike you off so you don't have to come back tomorrow. But I do want to thank you because after 3 hours, I can sleep well knowing I have heard from a professor at Berkeley. Thank you.
Everybody wants to know what's happening.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's 6 o'clock, 3 hours. My posterior is starting to wear a little thin. As you can see, it is my intention for everybody to be heard within certain limits of civility. Tomorrow we will be reconvening at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So please feel free to be here. Those who have signed up today, you will be taken in that order tomorrow, and we do look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.